The north wind carried ash and rumor in equal measure the morning Duke Cadric Blackwood executed his own brother. No trial, no final words, just the dull crack of bone meeting stone in the courtyard below his tower, while ravens circled overhead and the household staff pretended not to hear. The body was removed before breakfast. The blood stain remained for 3 days as a reminder to anyone who thought family loyalty meant more than absolute obedience in Thornmarch. They said Caedric had become something worse than cruel. He had become efficient, and efficiency, when applied to human life, looked exactly like murder dressed in morning light. But here is what the songs and whispered stories never tell you about powerful men who rule through fear. They do not sleep well. They do not trust easily. And they absolutely do not allow themselves to feel anything resembling weakness, because weakness in a kingdom built on violence is just another word for death waiting to arrive. So when the most dangerous man in the Northern Territories stood alone in his private chambers 3 weeks after the execution, staring at the same bloodstain still visible from his window, the only question worth asking was not whether he regretted what he had done. It was whether he felt anything at all. Stay with me here. This is not a love story pretending to be complicated. This is a dissection of what happens when power and desire collide inside a man who has spent his entire life believing control is the only currency that matters. What you are about to witness will make you uncomfortable. It should. Because the truth about dominance and obsession is that they look identical from the outside, and the only way to tell them apart is to watch what happens when a man like Caedric finally encounters something he cannot command, cannot possess, and absolutely cannot let go. And that moment is coming faster than he realizes. The morning Caedric received word that Lady Alara Ashford had been summoned to Thornmarch Keep by royal decree, he was in the East Wing supervising the interrogation of a merchant accused of withholding tax revenue. The merchant was guilty. They always were. Caedric had learned years ago that innocence was a luxury only the powerless could afford to claim, and even then, it rarely saved them. He dismissed the guards with a gesture and walked the length of the corridor alone, his boots echoing against flagstone worn smooth by centuries of men who had believed themselves untouchable right up until the moment they were proven wrong. The walls here were bare stone, no tapestries, no portraits of distinguished ancestors. Caedric had ordered them removed when he inherited the duchy at 23, right after his father died choking on his own blood during a hunting accident that half the kingdom suspected was not an accident at all. No one investigated too closely. Asking questions about the Blackwood family required a level of courage most men did not possess. His steward, a thin man named Corvin who moved like a shadow and spoke even less, waited at the end of the hall holding a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. Caedric took it without stopping, broke the wax with his thumb, and read while still walking. The king requested his presence at court within the fortnight. Standard political theater. But buried in the formal language was something else. The Ashford family would be in attendance as guests of the crown, their lands and titles under review following recent allegations of disloyalty. Caedric stopped walking. Corvin stopped beside him and waited in silence. The Ashfords were minor nobility from the southern marches, barely significant enough to warrant attention under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Their patriarch had been executed 2 years ago for conspiracy, their estates seized, their children scattered across the kingdom like dice thrown against stone. And now they were being summoned back, which meant someone at court wanted to use them, or destroy what remained of them. Caedric folded the letter and slipped it inside his coat. When someone wants to destroy you, they rarely do it with armies anymore. That is too expensive and too public. Instead, they do it with invitations, with ceremonies, with the polite violence of social obligation that forces you into a room where everyone is smiling and half of them are plotting your death between courses of roasted pheasant and honey wine. He had attended enough of those dinners to recognize the shape of a trap being set. What he could not understand yet was why the Ashfords mattered enough to serve as bait. Corvin cleared his throat softly, the way he always did when he had information Caedric had not asked for, but needed anyway. It was one of the few qualities that had kept him alive in a household where most servants lasted less than a year before, requesting transfers to quieter estates where the Duke did not have a reputation for executing family members in the courtyard. "Speak," Caedric said without looking at him. "The Ashford daughter survived, my lord." "Lady Alara. She has been living under the protection of the Bishop of Westmarch since the execution. Quietly. No public appearances. No attempts to reclaim the family name. Until now. Exactly, my lord. Caedric resumed walking. Behind him, Corvin fell into step like a man accustomed to following predators through dark hallways. They passed through the main gallery where portraits of previous Blackwood dukes stared down from gilded frames, each one looking progressively more paranoid than the last. Caedric barely glanced at them. He had stopped caring about legacy the same day he realized his father had planned to have him killed and install his younger brother as heir instead. That particular problem had resolved itself with poison and a well-timed riding accident, and Caedric had spent the last 8 years making absolutely certain no one ever doubted his willingness to do worse if necessary. The court thinks the girl is harmless, Corvin continued. A pawn the king can use to demonstrate mercy by restoring a disgraced bloodline. It will make him look generous without costing him anything of value. And what do you think? Caedric asked. I think mercy is always expensive, my lord, especially when it is offered publicly. Caedric smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Corvin had been with him long enough to know that smile meant someone was about to have a very bad week and would probably not survive it. Find out everything about Lady Alara Ashford, Caedric said. Where she has been, who she has spoken to, what she wants, and more importantly, who wants her back at court badly enough to risk angering me by bringing her there. Corvin bowed slightly and disappeared into a side passage that led to the network of service corridors where the real work of the keep happened, away from the eyes of nobles who still believed power was something you inherited rather than something you took and held by making everyone else too terrified to try taking it back. Caedric continued toward his private study, a room at the highest point of the keep with windows facing north toward mountains still capped with snow even in late spring. He preferred the cold. It kept people away. It reminded him that survival required constant attention and that comfort was just another word for the moment before everything fell apart. He poured himself whiskey from a crystal decanter that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had died peacefully in his sleep surrounded by family and was therefore, in Caedric's opinion, either extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily weak, possibly both. The liquor burned going down. He finished it and poured another. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frames and carrying the smell of rain from the mountains. Somewhere below in the village, church bells rang the hour. Life continued its predictable rhythm, while men like Caedric stood in towers built by their ancestors and tried to decide whether the next threat would come from outside the walls or inside them. Most of the time, it came from inside. That was the part the songs always got wrong. They made it sound like being powerful meant being safe. But the truth was exactly the opposite. The higher you climbed, the more people wanted to pull you down. And the only way to stay on top was to make sure everyone who thought about it ended up as a cautionary tale told around fires in village taverns. Caedric set the glass down and walked to the window. The bloodstain in the courtyard was still visible even from this height. He had ordered it left there deliberately. A reminder. Not for himself, he did not need reminders of what he was capable of, but for everyone else. For the guards who stood watch. For the servants who crossed the yard every morning. For the visiting nobles who arrived thinking they could negotiate with him like he was civilized. His brother had thought family meant protection. His brother had been wrong, and now everyone who entered Thornmarch Keep knew exactly what happened to people who miscalculated the distance between Caedric Blackwood and mercy. The journey to the capital took 4 days by carriage over roads that turned to mud the moment the rain started, which it did with almost vindictive consistency the entire way. Caedric traveled with minimal escort, 6 soldiers, Corvin, and a driver who had been making this route for 20 years and knew better than to attempt conversation. They stopped each night at coaching inns that smelled like wet wool and desperation, where the innkeepers recognized the Blackwood crest on the carriage door and immediately provided the best rooms available while carefully avoiding eye contact. Caedric did not mind. He preferred being feared to being liked. Fear was predictable. Fear kept people honest in ways affection never could. On the 3rd night, Corvin brought him a report compiled from sources Caedric did not ask about and did not need to know. He read it by candlelight while rain hammered the roof, and somewhere below in the common room, men gambled away wages they could not afford to lose. Lady Alara Ashford was 24, unmarried, educated by private tutors before her father's execution, then placed under the protection of the church when the family estates were seized. She had spent 2 years in near isolation at the Westmarch bishopric, living quietly and apparently making no attempts to contact former family allies or rebuild political connections, which meant either she was genuinely broken by what had happened to her family, or she was smart enough to wait until the right moment to act. Kedrick suspected the latter. Broken people did not get invited back to court. They got forgotten in monasteries and unmarked graves. The report included a physical description: tall, dark-haired, pale-skinned, in the way of women who spent too much time indoors reading books instead of attending balls. No known romantic attachments. No scandals. No debts. Perfectly unremarkable on paper, which made her extremely dangerous in practice, because the only people who survived complete political destruction without leaving any trace of ambition were the ones who had learned to hide it so well it looked like acceptance. Kedrick closed the report and handed it back to Corvin. "She is bait," he said. "Yes, my lord, the question is whether she knows it." Corvin said nothing, which was his way of agreeing without committing to an opinion that might prove inconvenient later. It was a survival skill Kedrick appreciated because it meant Corvin understood the most important rule of serving powerful men. You could be right or you could be safe, but attempting both simultaneously was usually fatal. "Find out who arranged her return," Kedrick continued. "Someone at court wants me focused on the Ashford family instead of paying attention to something else. I want to know what that something else is before we arrive." Corvin bowed and left, closing the door silently behind him. Kedrick stood and walked to the narrow window overlooking the inn's courtyard. Below, ostlers moved between stalls checking horses while rain dripped from the stable roof in steady streams. Normal people doing normal work, completely unaware that 20 feet above them, a man was making decisions that would determine whether they lived or died in the conflicts to come. That was the thing about power nobody talked about honestly. It was not just the ability to destroy enemies. It was the weight of knowing your choices created ripples that drowned people who never even knew your name. Entire villages could burn because you made the wrong alliance. Families could starve because you blocked a trade route. Children could grow up without fathers because you needed to make an example of someone and their parent happened to be convenient. Kedrick had stopped losing sleep over it years ago, not because he did not care, but because caring was a luxury he could not afford, and the moment he started questioning whether his choices were just, he would hesitate, and hesitation in his position was just another word for suicide wearing the mask of conscience. He turned away from the window and returned to the small desk where maps of the capital were spread across stained wood. He had been studying them for weeks, memorizing routes between the palace and various noble estates, identifying which families had increased their guard presence recently, noting which ambassadors had arrived unexpectedly and which ones had left in a hurry. Patterns. Everything came down to patterns if you knew how to look. And what he saw in this capital's political landscape right now was the shape of something enormous preparing to move, like a landslide gathering weight on a mountainside right before it destroyed everything below. The king was dying. No official announcement yet, no public acknowledgement. But Kedrick had sources inside the palace who reported that the royal physicians were being summoned at increasingly frequent intervals, and the crown prince had begun holding private meetings with military commanders who had previously answered only to the king himself. Succession was coming, and succession in a kingdom like this was never peaceful, which meant the Ashford girl was not just bait. She was a test. Someone at court wanted to see how Kedrick would react to a potential threat, whether he would move against her immediately or wait to see what she did first. His response would tell them whether he was still the same ruthless bastard who had executed his own brother, or whether age and isolation had softened him into something manageable. They were about to be very disappointed. The capital rose from the river valley like a collection of bad decisions given architectural form. Stone buildings crowded against each other in streets that had been laid out by drunk city planners 3 centuries ago and never properly updated. The palace dominated the eastern hill. All white marble and gold leaf designed to make visiting nobility feel appropriately insignificant. Kedrick's carriage rolled through the merchant quarter at midday, while crowds pressed against the sides of the street, selling everything from stolen silverware to children too young to know they were being sold. Guards in royal livery stood on corners looking bored and corrupt in equal measure. Beggars worked the spaces between market stalls with the efficiency of people who understood that poverty was a job like any other and required just as much skill to do successfully. This was the heart of civilization, apparently. Kedrick had always found it depressing. They passed through the palace gates without incident. His family name still carried enough weight that minor officials did not dare delay him. and entered the sprawling complex of courtyards and gardens where the kingdom's elite pretended the rest of the country did not exist. A royal steward met them in the main courtyard, a soft-faced man in embroidered robes who bowed exactly as deeply as protocol required and not 1 inch further. He informed Ceadric that rooms had been prepared in the East Wing and that the king requested his presence at tonight's welcoming banquet. Not requested, commanded, but phrased politely enough that refusing would be an insult. Ceadric dismissed his escort and followed the steward through marble corridors lined with portraits of kings who had all died, convinced they were immortal, right up until the moment they were proven wrong. Palace servants moved through the halls like ghosts, heads down, never making eye contact, trained from birth to be invisible because visibility in a place like this was dangerous. His rooms were exactly what he expected, luxurious, ostentatious, and almost certainly monitored. He made a note of the 2 servants assigned to his chambers, both young, both too carefully polite, and mentally cataloged them as spies. Not that it mattered. He had nothing to hide that anyone did not already know or suspect. He was a killer. Everyone knew it. The only question was who he would kill next. Corvin appeared an hour later with fresh intelligence gathered from sources who operated in the gray spaces between official channels and outright crime. He reported that Lady Alara Ashford had arrived yesterday and was staying in the guest wing under light guard. She had not left her room since arriving. No visitors, no messages sent or received. Waiting, Ceadric said. Or being kept isolated, Corvin suggested. Same thing in this place. He dismissed Corvin and spent the afternoon reading letters from his estate managers detailing crop yields and tax revenue and which tenants were behind on payments. The work of governance never stopped just because you were away from home. Someone had to make sure the duchy continued functioning, and Ceadric had learned early that delegation was just another word for giving other people the opportunity to steal from you. As evening approached, he dressed in formal clothing that made him look exactly like what he was. A northern lord who had come to court not to make friends but to remind everyone that Thornmarch remained independent, well-armed, and utterly uninterested in the political games being played by men too weak to rule their own territories without constant royal approval. The banquet hall was everything he hated about court life concentrated into one enormous room. Crystal chandeliers hung from gilded ceilings. Musicians played behind silk screens. Nobles in expensive clothing that cost more than most villages earned in a year moved through the space like colorful birds convinced their plumage made them important. Ceadric entered alone and immediately became the subject of whispered conversations that stopped the moment he looked in their direction. He had that effect. Men who had fought wars and women who had survived court intrigue for decades still went quiet when he walked past because some part of them recognized that danger was not always loud. Sometimes it was just a tall man in black clothing who moved through crowds like he owned the ground beneath his feet and everyone standing on it. He accepted a glass of wine from a servant and positioned himself near one of the tall windows overlooking the gardens. From here, he could watch the entire room without appearing to pay attention. Old habit. You did not survive this long without learning to track threats the way predators tracked prey. The king arrived with appropriate ceremony, trumpets, announcements, everyone bowing in unison like crops bending before wind. He looked older than Ceadric remembered. Thinner, the kind of thin that came from illness rather than discipline. He wore enough jewelry to buy a small army, which was either compensation for mortality or a signal that he was still powerful enough that wealth did not matter. Ceadric bowed exactly as much as protocol required. The king nodded in his direction without smiling. They had never liked each other. That was fine. Mutual dislike was more honest than false friendship, and Ceadric had always preferred enemies he could see coming. The crowd settled into the rhythm of formal dinners, elaborate courses served by silent staff, conversations carefully modulated to sound casual while actually being negotiations over land and titles and marriage alliances. Ceadric ate mechanically and spoke only when directly addressed, giving answers that were technically polite but contained just enough edge that no one attempted extended conversation. And then she entered. Lady Alara Ashford walked into the banquet hall, escorted by a minor functionary whose name Ceadric did not bother learning. She wore dark blue silk that looked expensive but not ostentatious, her hair pulled back in a style that was fashionable 2 seasons ago. Everything about her presentation said, "I am trying not to be noticed," which meant she very much wanted to be noticed but was smart enough to make it look accidental. Ceadric watched her move through the crowd, noting how other nobles reacted. Some ignored her completely. Others stared with this kind of curiosity people reserve for public executions and fallen women. A few older lords looked angry, which suggested they had been allies of her father and felt betrayed by his treason. She did not approach anyone directly, did not attempt to revive old connections, just accepted a glass of wine and positioned herself near a column where she could observe without being obviously observed, exactly what he would have done. That was when Kaedric realized this was going to be significantly more complicated than he had anticipated, because the woman standing across the banquet hall, hiding behind carefully constructed invisibility, was not broken, and she was not bait. She was hunting, and the worst part, the part that made his instincts sharpen in ways they had not in years, was that he could not yet tell whether she was hunting him or hunting the same enemies he was tracking through this nest of vipers pretending to be civilization. The dinner continued for another 2 hours. Speeches were made. Toasts were offered. The king announced that he was pleased to welcome back representatives of houses that had temporarily fallen from favor, proving that the crown valued reconciliation and forgiveness, which was royal language for, "I am showing everyone how merciful I can be while also reminding you that I decide who lives and who dies, and there is nothing any of you can do about it." Kaedric noticed Alara did not drink during the king's speech, did not smile, just stood perfectly still like a woman who had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible even when everyone was looking at you. When the formal portion of the evening ended and nobles began migrating toward smaller gatherings in adjacent rooms, Kaedric waited until Alara started moving toward one of the garden exits. Then he intercepted her path with the casual precision of someone who had spent years learning how to corner people without appearing threatening. She stopped when she saw him, did not step back, did not lower her eyes. That was the second time she surprised him. "Lady Ashford," he said. His voice was quiet enough that no one nearby could hear, but loud enough that she understood this was not a chance encounter. "Duke Blackwood." Her voice matched his for volume and contained exactly 0 warmth. "I had hoped we might meet under less theatrical circumstances. Court is nothing but theater. Surely you remember that from before your family's unfortunate difficulties." Her expression did not change. Unfortunate difficulties. Is that what we call treason and execution now? I call it what it was. Your father made choices. Choices have consequences. And you would know all about consequences, wouldn't you? She took a small step forward instead of back. "Tell me, Duke, do you still see your brother's face when you close your eyes at night? Or have you killed enough people since then that they all blend together?" The room around them continued its polite chaos, completely unaware that 2 people were having a conversation that in any other context would have ended with weapons drawn. Kaedric smiled. It was the same smile that had preceded his brother's execution, the same smile that made experienced soldiers nervous. "Careful, Lady Ashford. Grief makes people say foolish things, and foolish things said to the wrong people tend to become permanent problems. I am not grieving, Duke. I stopped grieving the day I realized my father died because men like you convinced men like the king that loyalty was less valuable than land. So let us not pretend this is about consequences or justice or any of the other words powerful men use when they mean murder." She finished her wine and set the empty glass on a passing servant's tray without breaking eye contact. "I know exactly what you are, Duke Blackwood. The question is whether you have figured out what I am yet." Then she walked past him toward the gardens, leaving Kaedric standing alone near the column, watching her disappear into the darkness beyond the torchlight. For several long seconds, he did not move. Around him, the banquet continued. Nobles laughed. Musicians played. Servants cleared plates. The machinery of civilization ground forward exactly as it always did, completely indifferent to the fact that something significant had just occurred. Corvin appeared at his elbow like a shadow materializing from smoke. "My lord?" "Follow her," Kaedric said quietly. "I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she speaks to, everything." Corvin melted back into the crowd without acknowledgement. Kaedric stood alone near the window looking out at gardens where Lady Alara Ashford had vanished into the darkness. And for the first time in 8 years, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since the day he poisoned his father and framed his brother for it. Uncertainty. Not about what needed to be done. He never had uncertainty about that. But about whether the woman he was beginning to hunt was going to be his greatest enemy or his only equal, and which of those outcomes would be more dangerous when the kingdom finally tore itself apart and men like him had to decide whether power was still worth the price of keeping it. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. The storm was coming, and Kaedric suspected, correctly, as it would turn out, that by the time it passed, Either he or Lady Alara Ashford would be dead. Possibly both. The rain continued through the night and into morning, turning the palace gardens into a maze of mud and drowning roses. Cedric stood at his window watching dawn break over the capital like a wound opening across the sky, and thought about all the ways a man could be destroyed without ever drawing a sword. Reputation could be dismantled with whispers. Alliances could collapse from a single well-placed lie. Entire fortunes could evaporate because someone convinced the right people that you were weak, distracted, or worse, compromised by something as mundane as desire. He had built his authority on the principle that he was incapable of compromise, that he felt nothing except the cold mathematics of power, that attempting to use human connection against him was like trying to drown a man who had already learned to breathe underwater. Lady Alara Ashford had looked at him last night like she knew that was a lie, which meant she was either suicidal or significantly more dangerous than anyone at court realized. Corvin entered without knocking, which was the arrangement they had established years ago. Privacy was a luxury neither of them could afford. He carried a leather folder containing the night's intelligence and set it on the desk without ceremony. She met with no one, Corvin reported. Returned to her rooms immediately after leaving the banquet. No messages sent, no visitors. She stood at her window for approximately 2 hours before extinguishing her candles. Watching what? The eastern courtyard, where the servants enter and exit, where supply wagons arrive. Mapping the palace, Cedric said, learning patterns. Corvin nodded. Someone taught her well. Cedric opened the folder and scanned the contents. Lists of names, financial records, a sketch of the palace layout with certain rooms marked in red ink. His sources had been busy while he slept, pulling together pieces of a puzzle he still could not fully see. The Ashford family fortune was not entirely confiscated, he read aloud. Interesting. According to these records, approximately 40% of their holdings were transferred to a trust controlled by the Westmarch bishopric before the execution. Legal. Untouchable. Generating income for the past 2 years, which means Lady Alara is not destitute. She has resources. She has been planning, and she let everyone believe otherwise. Cedric closed the folder and looked at Corvin. The older man's face revealed nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They had worked together long enough that entire conversations could happen in silence. Find out who arranged the trust, Cedric said. Someone helped her hide that money. Someone with enough legal expertise and political protection to make it invisible to the Crown's investigators. That person is either her ally or her handler, and I need to know which before this goes any further. Corvin left without acknowledgement. Cedric returned to the window. Below in the courtyard, servants were already moving between buildings carrying laundry and firewood and chamber pots. The machinery of civilization maintained by people who would never be remembered in the histories being written by the same nobles they served. His father had told him once that the secret to ruling was understanding that most people wanted to be led. They craved certainty even when certainty meant oppression. They preferred a tyrant who was predictable to freedom that required them to make their own choices and live with the consequences. Cedric had believed that for years, but watching Alara Ashford walk away from him last night with her spine straight and her fear buried so deep it looked like courage. He wondered if his father had been wrong about at least one thing. Some people could not be led. They could only be broken or matched. And he was beginning to suspect matching her would be more dangerous than breaking her, because breaking people was easy. Matching them required acknowledging they were capable of the same ruthlessness you possessed, which meant acknowledging you were not as singular as you had convinced yourself. That kind of recognition had consequences. It meant the carefully constructed walls between monster and man started to blur. And once that happened, you either became something worse or you started asking questions about what you had already done that could not be undone. Cedric had spent 8 years avoiding those questions. He was not prepared to start answering them now. The king's private council met in a windowless chamber designed specifically to prevent eavesdropping, which was ironic because Cedric's spy network had compromised it 3 years ago by bribing the man who installed the ventilation grates. He received transcripts of every meeting within 6 hours, edited for relevance and annotated with analysis. This morning's meeting confirmed what he had already suspected. Succession was not just coming, it was being actively negotiated behind closed doors while the king deteriorated in ways the court pretended not to notice. The crown prince had met privately with 4 major duchies and offered concessions on tax policy in exchange for military support when the transition occurred. The northern lords were demanding territorial adjustments. The The merchant guilds wanted commercial protections written into the succession decree. Everyone was positioning themselves for the moment the king finally died, and the kingdom either held together or fractured into civil war. And in the middle of this carefully balanced chaos, someone had decided to bring back the daughter of a traitor and parade her in front of the entire court. Cadric sat in his chambers reading the transcript for the third time, searching for patterns in the language. Who spoke first? Who interrupted whom? Who stayed silent when they should have objected? Lord Chancellor Marius had been the one to suggest restoring the Ashford name, framed it as a gesture of reconciliation that would demonstrate the crown's strength and mercy. 3 other council members had supported it immediately. 2 had objected but been overruled. The king had approved it while coughing into a silk handkerchief that had apparently been stained with blood by the time the meeting ended. Marius was ambitious. Everyone knew it. He had spent 20 years accumulating power through careful appointments and strategic marriages, building a network that operated just below the threshold of outright treason. If the succession went badly, Marius was positioned to be either the next king's most valuable ally or his most dangerous enemy, which meant using Alara as bait served multiple purposes. If Ceadric moved against her directly, it would look like he was attacking the king's decision, which would give the crown prince justification to move against Thornmarch. If Ceadric did nothing, it would look like he was either growing soft or calculating his next move, which would make other nobles question his reliability as an ally. If Ceadric tried to bring her into his own network, it would expose his methods and make him vulnerable to infiltration. A perfect trap. Elegant, even. The kind of strategy that only worked if everyone believed Alara was actually bait instead of a weapon aimed at something else entirely. Ceadric set the transcript aside and walked to his desk where maps of the kingdom were spread across polished wood. He had been studying these for weeks, tracking troop movements and supply routes, and which noble houses had been quietly reinforcing their borders. War was coming. Not today. Not next month. But soon enough that smart people were already choosing sides and preparing for the moment when choosing wrong would be fatal. The question was whether Alara Ashford was choosing sides or creating her own. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Unusual. Corvin never knocked. Servants knew better than to disturb him uninvited. That left either palace officials or someone foolish enough to think social convention protected them from his temper. He opened the door expecting some minor functionary with a message from the king. Instead, Lady Alara Ashford stood in the corridor wearing a simple gray dress and an expression that suggested she had walked here deliberately knowing exactly how dangerous it was, and had decided the risk was acceptable. Duke Blackwood, she said, I hope I am not interrupting anything important. Everything I do is important, Lady Ashford. The question is whether you are worth interrupting it for. She smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. That depends entirely on whether you prefer polite lies or dangerous truths. Ceadric stepped back and gestured for her to enter. She did without hesitation, walking past him into the room and directly to the window overlooking the courtyard. She stood there for several seconds studying the view before turning to face him. You had me followed last night, she said. Your man was competent but not invisible. I counted him 3 separate times between the banquet hall and my chambers. Ceadric closed the door and remained standing near it. If you noticed him, he wanted you to notice him. Possible. Or you are not as careful as your reputation suggests. My reputation suggests I have people executed in courtyards and leave the bodies there as warnings. Do you think careful is the primary concern? She crossed the room and picked up one of the transcripts from his desk, scanned it quickly, and set it back down exactly where it had been. No, she said. I think control is your primary concern. Careful is just one of the tools you use to maintain it, but control requires knowing what is actually happening. And I suspect you are currently missing several important pieces of information. Then perhaps you should enlighten me. Unless you walked into my chambers this morning just to demonstrate that you are clever enough to breach palace security and foolish enough to do it alone. I am alone because I wanted this conversation to be private. And I am clever enough to know that you will not harm me here because doing so would create exactly the kind of spectacle you have spent years avoiding. You kill people quietly, Duke, in dungeons and dark hallways. Not in guest quarters at the royal palace where witnesses could hear screaming. She was absolutely correct, which made her either extremely intelligent or operating on information that should not be available to someone who had supposedly spent 2 years isolated in a bishopric. Ceadric walked to his desk and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He offered her one. She accepted it without drinking. What do you want, Lady Ashford? The same thing you want, to survive the succession. Everyone wants to survive. That is not a plan. That is just fear wearing the mask of strategy. Then let me be more specific. I want to destroy Lord Chancellor Marius. I want to see him stripped of title and executed the same way my father was executed. I want his family ruined, his allies scattered, his name erased from history except as a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake cruelty for statecraft. She took a small sip of whiskey and set the glass down. And I think you want the exact same thing, because Marius orchestrated your brother's attempt to kill you 3 years ago, and you have been waiting for the right moment to retaliate ever since. The room went very quiet. Outside, church bells rang in the distance. Servants moved through corridors. Palace guards changed shifts. Life continued its predictable patterns, while two people stood in a room discussing murder, like other people discussed weather. Cedric set his own glass down and studied her face, looking for fear, for hesitation, for any sign that she was bluffing or improvising or overplaying a weak hand. He found none of those things. "That is quite an accusation," he said carefully. "It is not an accusation. It is a fact. I have documentation proving Marius provided your brother with both the poison and the plan to use it. He convinced your brother you were planning to have him killed and that acting first was self-defense. He wanted you dead so he could install your brother as a puppet duke who would owe him everything. And how exactly did you acquire this documentation while living under the protection of the church in Westmarch? The same way you acquire most of your intelligence, Duke. I paid people, not with money necessarily, but with information, with leverage, with promises I may or may not keep depending on whether they remain useful. You are not the only person in this kingdom who understands that power is just structured ruthlessness dressed in formal clothing." She walked to the window again and looked out at the courtyard where servants were loading wagons with supplies for the kitchens. "My father was not a traitor," she continued. "He was framed by Marius because he discovered evidence of tax fraud that would have implicated half the royal council. Marius had him executed before he could present that evidence to the king. Executed him publicly and brutally enough that no one else would dare investigate. Then he seized our lands and used the revenue to fund his network of spies and bought officials. Cedric already knew most of this. His own investigation had reached similar conclusions 2 years ago. What he had not known was that Alara knew it too, which changed the calculation significantly. If you have proof, why bring it to me? Why not go directly to the king? Because the king is dying and Marius controls the crown prince. If I present evidence now, it will disappear, and I will have a writing accident before the weekends. But if you move against Marius, it becomes a conflict between two powerful dukes, and the crown cannot afford to lose your support during the succession. You have leverage I do not have, and more importantly, you have the reputation for surviving fights that would kill weaker men. What makes you think I will not simply take your evidence and use it for my own purposes without giving you what you want? Because you are ruthless, Duke, not stupid. I have copies, I have witnesses. And more importantly, I have spent 2 years establishing relationships with people you have not been paying attention to because you were focused on the usual suspects. Merchants, priests, servants who empty chamber pots and hear things powerful men forget to whisper. She turned to face him directly. You can kill me right now if you want. You are certainly capable of it. But doing so would cost you the only ally you have who understands what Marius actually is and has been, building the infrastructure to bring him down while you were busy ruling through fear in Thornmarch. Cedric looked at her for a long time without speaking. Rain had started again outside. Thunder rolled across the city like artillery fire from a distant war that had not quite reached the capital yet, but was coming closer every day. Everything about this should have felt like a trap. A young woman with a destroyed family and obvious motive for revenge walks into his chambers claiming to have evidence against his enemy and offering alliance. Too convenient, too perfectly aligned with what he wanted to hear. But if it was a trap, it was the most sophisticated one he had encountered in years, because her logic was flawless, and her presentation was exactly how he would have approached this situation if their positions were reversed. Which meant either she was genuinely this capable or someone had trained her to be this capable, specifically to manipulate him, and he could not afford to guess wrong about which possibility was true. "Show me the proof," he said finally. "Not yet. First we establish terms. I do not negotiate with people in my chambers uninvited. Yes, you do. You are doing it right now. You just prefer to pretend you are not. Because maintaining the illusion of complete control is more important to you than actually achieving your goals efficiently." She picked up her whiskey glass and finished it in one swallow. "Here are my terms. We pool our intelligence on Marius. We coordinate our moves. And when this is finished and he is dead, you support the restoration of my family's lands and title. Full restoration. No conditions. No secondary claims. The Ashford name returns to the rolls with the same standing we held before my father's execution. And in exchange, you get a partner who understands that survival in this kingdom requires being more ruthless than everyone around you, but smart enough to make that ruthlessness look like justice. You get access to networks you did not know existed. You get someone who can move through spaces you cannot access, because people underestimate women in ways they do not underestimate men who execute their brothers in courtyards. And if I refuse, then you will spend the next 6 months trying to destroy Marius on your own while he continues consolidating power around the crown prince. And by the time the king finally dies, you will discover that Thornmarch is surrounded by hostile territories and your supply lines have been cut, and the kingdom you thought you understood has already decided you are the problem that needs to be eliminated. She set the glass down with enough force that it made a sharp sound against the wood. I am not asking you to trust me, Duke. I am asking you to recognize that we both want the same man dead, and that achieving that goal requires more than brute force and intimidation. It requires precision. It requires allies who can operate in places where your reputation prevents you from moving freely. Kedrick walked to the window and stood beside her, looking out at the rain-soaked courtyard. Below, a servant slipped on wet stones and fell hard enough that other workers rushed to help him up. Life and pain continuing in parallel while people in towers made decisions that would multiply that pain exponentially if they chose wrong. You are asking me to give up the one advantage I have always maintained, he said quietly. The certainty that I answer to no one. That I make decisions alone and live with the consequences alone because shared power is just delayed betrayal. I am asking you to recognize that the world has changed and your approach no longer works as well as it did when you first inherited Thornmarch. The kingdom is fragmenting. Alliances are forming faster than you can track them. And men like Marius thrive in chaos because they have been preparing for it while you were busy maintaining order through fear in a single duchy. She turned to look at him directly. You are powerful, Duke. Genuinely dangerous. But you are also isolated. And isolation in a kingdom tearing itself apart is just another word for extinction waiting to happen. The rain intensified, hammering against the windows, hard enough to make the glass vibrate. Somewhere in the palace below, someone was shouting orders. Kitchen staff preparing for tonight's dinner. Guards organizing patrol rotations. The endless machinery of civilization grinding forward, while people in private chambers decided which parts of that machinery to burn down and which parts to preserve. Kedrick made his decision. Not because he trusted Alara Ashford. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford, but because her analysis was correct and his instincts told him that whatever else she might be, she was genuinely committed to destroying Marius, which meant their goals aligned closely enough that cooperation was less dangerous than opposition, at least for now. 1 week, he said. You have 1 week to provide proof of Marius's involvement in my brother's conspiracy. Real proof, not speculation or hearsay, documents, testimony from witnesses who will survive cross-examination, evidence that would stand up in front of the royal council even if half of them are Marius's creatures. Alara nodded. Agreed. And in return? In return, I do not have you arrested for trespassing and interrogated about how you acquired sensitive information regarding internal duchy politics. She smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her. Not warm exactly, but honest in its recognition that they were both playing the same game at the same level and had just agreed to temporary alliance based entirely on mutual self-interest rather than any illusion of morality or justice. One more thing, she said. Whatever we do to Marius, it has to be public. It has to be so thoroughly documented and so obviously justified that no one can claim it was political assassination. Because if we kill him quietly, we become exactly what he is, and the crown will move against us both as soon as the succession is secure. Kedrick considered this. She was right again. Justice performed in dungeons looked like murder regardless of the victim's crimes. But justice performed in courtrooms or public squares could be dressed up as law and order, which was the kind of violence the kingdom not only tolerated but celebrated. Agreed, he said. Public execution or nothing. Alara extended her hand. He looked at it for several seconds before accepting. Her grip was firm, professional. The handshake of two people who understood they were binding themselves to something that would likely end in blood, but were committed to seeing it through anyway, because the alternative was worse. She released his hand and walked toward the door, paused with her fingers on the handle. "You're wondering if I am playing you," she said without turning around. "If this entire conversation was designed to manipulate you into doing something that serves my interests but destroys you in the process." The thought had crossed my mind. Good. That means you are not as arrogant as your reputation suggests. The answer is, maybe I am playing you, and maybe I am not. You will find out when Marius is dead, and we see whether I honor our agreement or betray you immediately afterward. She opened the door and looked back at him one final time. Sleep well, Duke, or do not. Either way, this ends in approximately 6 weeks when the king dies, and the succession forces everyone to choose sides. Try not to choose wrong. Then she was gone, leaving Caedric alone in his chambers with the rain hammering the windows and the distinct impression that he had just agreed to something that would either save him or destroy him, and the outcome depended entirely on whether a woman he barely knew was actually an ally or the most sophisticated trap anyone had ever set for him. He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily. Corvin materialized from the adjoining room where he had apparently been listening to the entire conversation. His expression revealed nothing. "Your assessment," Caedric said. "She is either exactly what she claims, or she is working for someone who understands you well enough to construct the perfect bait. Those are the two options I identified as well. The question is which risk you can afford. Working with her might get you killed. Not working with her definitely leaves you vulnerable to Marius during the succession." Caedric looked at the maps spread across his desk, lines and territories and the shapes of violence waiting to erupt across the kingdom the moment the king finally stopped breathing. "Follow her anyway," he said. "I want to know if she contacts anyone after leaving here. I want to know if anyone contacts her. I want to know if a single word of what she just told me was actual truth or carefully constructed fiction. And if it is fiction, then I will kill her myself, quietly, in a dark hallway where no one will find the body for days." He paused. "But if it is true, then we have 6 weeks to destroy a man who has spent 20 years making himself untouchable, and we are going to need every advantage we can get." Corvin nodded and disappeared back into the shadows. Caedric sat alone in the silence that followed, listening to rain and thunder and the distant sounds of a palace where hundreds of people were all simultaneously preparing for a future that would only benefit a handful of them, while the rest drowned in the violence that always accompanied power-changing hands. He thought about his brother standing in that courtyard 8 years ago, confused right up until the moment the sentence was carried out. Thought about his father choking on poison while trying to say something that might have been an apology or might have been a curse. Thought about every choice he had made since then that had brought him to this moment where his survival depended on trusting a woman whose family he had helped destroy and who had every reason to want him dead. This was what power actually looked like once you stripped away the ceremonies and the formal clothing and the pretense that violence could be civilized if you just performed it with proper etiquette. It looked like standing alone in a room making calculations about which betrayals you could afford and which ones would kill you, and hoping you guessed right because the penalty for guessing wrong was extinction. And the worst part was knowing that even if you guessed right this time, there would be another calculation waiting immediately after, and another one after that. And eventually you would guess wrong and someone else would be standing in a room like this trying to decide if destroying you was worth the risk. That was the real trap of power. Not that you could not hold it, but that holding it required becoming the kind of person who could never stop fighting long enough to remember why you wanted it in the first place. The next 3 days passed in careful choreography. Caedric attended court functions and spoke to visiting nobles about trade policy and border security, while his agents moved through the capital gathering intelligence on Marius's network. Elara appeared at precisely timed intervals, always visible but never engaging directly, letting the court see them in proximity without obvious connection. They met twice more in neutral locations. Once in the palace archives where old tax records were stored and student scholars worked late into the night. Once in a garden chapel during morning services when everyone else was focused on prayers and hymns. Each time, Elara provided more evidence. Financial records showing payments from Marius to known assassins. Letters written in code but decipherable with the right key, which she provided. Testimony from servants who had witnessed conversations they should not have heard and been smart enough to survive by staying quiet until someone made it worth their while to speak. It was real. All of it. Either that or it was the most elaborate fabrication Kaedric had ever seen, constructed by someone with resources and patience that defied reasonable assessment. He had Corvin verify everything independently. Cross-reference names. Confirm dates. Check whether witnesses actually existed and could be produced if needed. Everything checked. Which meant either Alara was legitimate or whoever was controlling her had anticipated his verification process and constructed supporting evidence layers deep. The third option was the one that kept him awake at night. That Alara was legitimate and working for her own interests, but those interests only aligned with his, temporarily, and would diverge at exactly the moment when divergence would be most dangerous for him. That was the version of reality that felt most accurate. People rarely betrayed you immediately. They waited until you were committed, until you had made choices based on their information that could not be reversed, until destroying you would benefit them more than continuing the alliance. Kaedric had done exactly that to enough people that he recognized the pattern. On the fourth day, Lord Chancellor Marius requested a private audience. The meeting took place in Marius's estate outside the palace walls, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by gardens that cost more to maintain than most villages earned in a decade. Servants in matching livery moved through corridors. Guards stood at every entrance. The entire place radiated wealth and power and the absolute certainty that the man living here was untouchable. Kaedric arrived with minimal escort and was led to a study overlooking ornamental ponds where swans drifted between fountains. Marius stood at the window, a tall man in expensive robes who turned when Kaedric entered and smiled like they were old friends instead of enemies who had been circling each other for years. Duke Blackwood, thank you for accepting my invitation. You command the King's Council, Lord Chancellor. Your invitations are not really invitations. Marius laughed. Practical as always. I appreciate that about you. So many nobles hide behind courtesy when everyone knows we are all just negotiating power and pretending it is civilization. He gestured to chairs arranged near the window. Kaedric sat. Marius poured wine without asking if it was wanted, which was a power move dressed as hospitality. Kaedric accepted the glass and did not drink. I will be direct, Marius said. I know Lady Alara Ashford has approached you. I know you have been meeting. And I know you are considering whether to use her information against me. Kaedric's expression did not change. You have excellent sources. I have necessary sources. The kingdom is fragmenting, Duke. The succession will be contested regardless of what any of us do. In that environment, knowing who is talking to whom is not just intelligence gathering. It is survival. Then you know I have not decided whether Lady Ashford's claims have merit. They have merit. All of them. I did exactly what she says I did. Kaedric had not expected that. He kept his surprise buried but made a note that Marius was playing a different game than anticipated, which meant the trap was more sophisticated than simply denying everything, forcing Kaedric to prove accusations. Interesting admission, Kaedric said carefully. It is only an admission if I consider it a crime. I consider it politics. Your brother was attempting to have you killed. I provided information that allowed him to move first. He failed. You survived. The duchy remained stable. Where's the problem? You orchestrated a conspiracy that resulted in me having my own brother executed. I provided information. What you did with that information was your choice. And frankly, Duke, you made the correct choice. Your brother was weak. He would have destroyed Thornmarch within 5 years. You have made it stronger. I did you a favor. Marius took a long sip of wine and set the glass down. And now Lady Ashford wants to destroy me for that favor by convincing you I am your enemy. But I am not your enemy, Duke. I am the only person in this kingdom who understands what you actually are and values it accordingly. And what am I, exactly? Necessary. The kingdom needs men willing to make hard choices without drowning in guilt afterward. It needs rulers who understand that stability sometimes requires brutality, and that apologizing for necessary violence only weakens the structures keeping civilization from collapsing into chaos. He leaned forward slightly. The Crown Prince is weak. He believes in mercy and reconciliation and all the pleasant lies people tell themselves when they have never actually had to govern anything more complicated than a garden party. If he takes the throne without strong advisors who can make real decisions, this kingdom will tear itself apart within a year. I need you alive and powerful because you are one of the few people capable of preventing that collapse. So you are offering me what? A position on the council? I am offering you a partnership. You control the north. I control the capital. Together we manage the succession and ensure whoever takes the throne understands that their power depends on our support. We become the foundation holding the kingdom together while weaker men fight over titles that will not matter if everything burns down around them. Kedrick stood and walked to the window, looking out at swans and fountains and manicured gardens that represented wealth extracted from people who would never see the inside of an estate like this. And Lady Ashford? Collateral damage. She wants revenge for her father. Understandable. But her father was executed because he threatened the stability of the royal council during a sensitive period. His death was necessary. Her current actions are making the same mistake. She needs to be removed before she destabilizes the succession. Removed, quietly, efficiently, the kind of thing you have demonstrated considerable skill at over the years. Marius stood and walked to join him at the window. I am not asking you to betray any principles, Duke. I'm asking you to prioritize kingdom stability over personal revenge against a man who has only ever acted in service of keeping this country from collapsing. Work with me. Eliminate the threats we both face. And when the succession is complete, you will find that Thornmarch has expanded significantly, and your voice in the new government carries the weight it deserves. It was a good offer. Genuinely good. Everything Marius said was logical and probably even true from a certain perspective. Partnering with him would secure Caedric's position. Refusing would put him in opposition to the most powerful political operator in the kingdom during the most dangerous transition in generations, which was exactly why it was completely unacceptable. Because accepting it meant becoming exactly what Marius was, a man who believed stability justified any atrocity, and that power was its own moral justification. It meant acknowledging that human life was just a resource to be managed like grain reserves or military conscription. And while Caedric had done terrible things to maintain his position, he had never quite crossed the line into believing those things were actually good. That distinction might seem meaningless from the outside, but from the inside it was the only thing preventing him from becoming a monster who felt nothing except the cold satisfaction of control. I will consider your offer, Caedric said. Do not consider too long. The king has perhaps a month remaining. After that, choices become permanent and switching sides becomes fatal. Understood. Marius walked him to the door personally, a gesture of respect between equals that was designed to make Caedric feel valued. It probably worked on most people. But Caedric had spent too many years watching how predators moved to be comforted by friendly gestures, from someone who had just admitted to orchestrating lethal conspiracies as a standard business practice. He left the estate and climbed into his carriage while Corvin fell in beside him. Assessment, Caedric said once they were moving. He offered you exactly what you would need to survive the succession if you were willing to abandon Lady Ashford and accept him as a permanent partner. Yes. Are you considering it? No. Why not? Because partnership with Marius means permanent subordination dressed as cooperation. He controls the capital and the crown prince. Any arrangement we make, he wins eventually. And I did not survive this long by accepting positions where someone else determines how long I remain useful. Corvin nodded. So you are committed to working with Lady Ashford. I am committed to destroying Marius before he destroys me. Whether that requires continuing to work with Lady Ashford depends entirely on whether she is actually trustworthy or just using me to achieve her own goals before discarding me. And how will you determine that? By seeing what she does when the moment arrives where betraying me benefits her more than continuing our alliance. That seems like a dangerous way to test loyalty. All tests of loyalty are dangerous. The question is whether you run them before or after someone has the opportunity to kill you. The carriage rolled through capital streets while rain continued hammering the roof. Outside, people moved through their lives completely unaware that decisions being made in private chambers, inelegant. Estates would determine whether their city burned in civil war or survived intact through the succession. That was the thing about power most people did not understand. It was not the decisions themselves that mattered. It was who made them and whether those people cared at all about anything beyond their own survival. And right now, Caedric was choosing to work with a woman he did not trust to destroy a man who had just offered him everything he theoretically wanted, betting his life that somehow this gamble would work out better than accepting the safe option that guaranteed his continued power. It was possibly the most irrational thing he had done in 8 years, which either meant he was finally learning to think strategically beyond simple self-preservation, or he was walking directly into a trap that would get him killed. He suspected he would find out which in approximately 3 weeks when the king died and everyone's masks came off simultaneously. The proof arrived on the seventh day exactly as Alara had promised. Corvin brought it to Caedric's chambers in a locked case. Original documents bearing Marius's seal, testimony from 3 separate witnesses who had been placed under protection, and financial records that traced payments from the Lord Chancellor's personal accounts to known assassins and corrupt officials. It was comprehensive, damning, and most importantly, it was verified through sources completely independent of Alara's network, which meant either she was legitimate or the conspiracy against him was so sophisticated that it had compromised his own intelligence apparatus. Caedric spread the documents across his desk and read through them methodically, while Corvin watched in silence. When he finished, he looked up. "This is real." "Yes, my lord." "Which means we are now committed. Once we move against Marius using this evidence, there is no retreat. Either we succeed and he dies publicly, or we fail and he has us executed as conspirators." "Understood." Caedric stood and walked to the window. Outside, evening was settling over the capital. Lamps were being lit in windows. Merchants were closing shops. Families were gathering for dinner, while somewhere above them, in towers and private chambers, people were making decisions that would determine whether those families still had homes next month. "Send word to Lady Ashford," he said. "Tell her we move in 3 days during the king's birthday celebration. Maximum visibility. Maximum public documentation. We present the evidence to the Crown Prince directly in front of the entire court. He will have no choice but to act or lose credibility by appearing to protect obvious corruption. And if the Crown Prince refuses to act, then we have misread the situation and will both be arrested before morning." Corvin left to deliver the message. Caedric remained at the window watching darkness consume the city. This was the moment every calculation had been building toward. The point where theory became action and action became irreversible consequence. After this, there would be no ambiguity, no room for adjustment. Just forward momentum toward either victory or annihilation with nothing in between. He thought about his brother one final time. Standing in that courtyard looking confused and betrayed and completely unable to understand that mercy was not an option when survival was at stake. Caedric had not hesitated then. He would not hesitate now. Even if it meant trusting a woman whose father he had helped execute and whose every instinct should be screaming to destroy him the first chance she got. Because the alternative was accepting Marius's partnership, and that was not survival. That was just delayed execution with better furniture. The choice had been made. Now came the part where choices revealed their true cost. And in Caedric's experience, the cost was always higher than anyone anticipated. The king's birthday celebration began at noon with processions through the capital streets where citizens gathered behind rope barriers to watch nobles parade past in carriages that cost more than their houses. Flags hung from every building. Musicians played from platforms erected at major intersections. Children threw flowers that landed in mud and were trampled by horses before anyone noticed. Caedric watched from his carriage window and thought about how easy it would be to kill everyone in those other carriages if you had enough archers positioned on the right rooftops. 3 dozen men with crossbows. Maybe 4 volleys. The entire aristocracy dead before they realized what was happening. He dismissed the thought. Useful for contingency planning, but irrelevant to today's objective. Today was about precision, about presenting evidence in a context where refusal to act would be more dangerous for the Crown Prince than acting decisively. About forcing justice to occur in public where everyone could see it, and no one could claim later that politics had been disguised as law. Corvin sat across from him, reviewing the documents one final time. Everything was in order, testimony verified, witnesses secured in safe locations, backup copies distributed to 3 separate locations in case the originals were somehow destroyed or confiscated. They had planned for every contingency except the one that mattered. The palace courtyard was filled with carriages when they arrived. Nobles in formal dress moved through the crowd like expensive birds preening for each other. Guards in ceremonial armor stood at attention along the walls. Servants carried trays of wine and delicate pastries that would be consumed without anyone actually tasting them, because eating at these events was just another performance. Caedric stepped from his carriage and immediately located Alara Ashford standing near the fountain in dark green silk that made her look like she belonged at a funeral instead of a celebration. Their eyes met across the crowd. She nodded once, the signal they had agreed upon. Everything was ready. The presentation would happen during the formal banquet after the Crown Prince's speech. Maximum attendance, maximum visibility. The evidence would be delivered by Corvin to the royal steward, who would then be obligated to present it to the Crown Prince immediately. because ignoring sealed documents bearing the Blackwood crest during a public ceremony would be an insult that could not be overlooked. Perfect timing, perfect execution. Except Caedric's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, and he could not identify what. He had learned over years of survival to trust those instincts even when logic said everything was fine. The problem was that sometimes instincts were just paranoia wearing the mask of wisdom, and paranoia could make you hesitate at exactly the moment when hesitation was fatal. He moved through the crowd accepting greetings from nobles who smiled while calculating whether he was still worth cultivating as an ally. The political calculus was visible in their eyes. Thornmarch remained powerful, Caedric remained dangerous. But the succession was coming, and everyone knew alliances formed now would determine who survived, and who ended up executed or exiled when the dust settled. Lord Harwick approached with his daughter, a young woman who had been presented to Caedric 3 times at previous events as a potential marriage prospect. He deflected politely. Marriage was leverage he refused to surrender to anyone else's control. The moment he took a wife, she became a vulnerability that enemies could exploit, and he had spent too many years eliminating vulnerabilities to create new ones voluntarily. The crowd moved inside as trumpets announced the beginning of formal ceremonies. The throne room was exactly as ostentatious as expected. Gold leaf covered every surface that could be covered. Tapestries depicting ancient victories hung from walls. The throne itself sat on a raised platform designed to make everyone else feel appropriately small and insignificant. The king entered supported by 2 attendants. He looked worse than at the last public appearance. Thinner, grayer, the kind of decay that was visible even under expensive clothing and careful lighting. He managed to climb the steps to the throne, but the effort left him breathing hard enough that the entire court could hear it in the silence that followed. This was a man who had weeks at most, maybe days. The crown prince stood beside the throne looking exactly like what he was. A man who had spent his entire life preparing to rule and was now terrified that the actual moment had arrived. He was young, well-educated, surrounded by advisors who all had their own agendas, and completely unprepared for the reality that ruling meant making choices where every option resulted in people dying and you had to pick which death served your purposes best. Caedric had almost felt sympathy for him until he remembered that weakness in positions of power did not deserve sympathy. It deserved replacement. The ceremony proceeded through its predictable stages. The king gave a speech about legacy and duty that was probably written by someone else and delivered with the enthusiasm of a man reading his own eulogy. The crown prince thanked the assembled nobles for their loyalty while carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone who might interpret that as commitment. Various lords presented gifts that were really just elaborate bribes disguised as birthday presents. Caedric waited. Elara remained near the back of the hall. Corvin stood by the entrance with the sealed documents ready to be delivered at the prearranged signal. Everything was positioned correctly, and still his instincts screamed. The king concluded his remarks and gestured for the crown prince to speak. This was the moment. The prince would deliver standard platitudes about unity and strength. Then the banquet would begin. And during that transition, Corvin would approach the royal steward, and the trap would spring shut around Marius with the full weight of public ceremony behind it. The crown prince stepped forward, but instead of speaking about unity, he gestured toward the guards positioned along the walls, and everything fell apart. Guards moved with coordinated precision toward 3 specific targets simultaneously. Caedric saw it happening and understood immediately that they had been waiting for exactly this moment when everyone was assembled and distracted. The first guards reached Lord Pemberton, a minor noble with holdings in the Western Territories. They seized him before he could react. Pemberton started to protest, but was silenced by a sword hilt to the face that dropped him to the marble floor bleeding. The second group moved toward Elara. Caedric felt his entire body go cold. She did not run, did not scream, just stood perfectly still as guards surrounded her, and one of them produced chains that looked like they had been prepared specifically for this purpose. The third group was moving toward him. Caedric's hand went to his sword, but Corvin caught his wrist in a grip that was simultaneously restraining and protective. "Do not!" Corvin hissed. "Not here. Not yet." The crown prince's voice cut through the chaos. "By order of the king and the royal council, I am placing these individuals under arrest for conspiracy against the crown. Evidence has been presented proving their coordination in a plot to overthrow the succession through assassination and false testimony designed to destabilize legitimate authority during this sensitive transition." The words were formal, rehearsed, delivered with the kind of certainty that came from reading prepared statements rather than actual conviction. Kedrick watched Alara being led away in chains. Her face revealed nothing. No fear, no surprise, no anger. Just the blank expression of someone who had expected this exact outcome and was now watching it unfold according to plan. Not her plan, someone else's plan. And Kedrick had walked directly into it because he had been so focused on destroying Marius that he had failed to see he was not the hunter in this scenario. He was the prey. The guards reached him but did not immediately attack. Their captain, a man Kedrick recognized from previous court functions, stopped at a respectful distance. Duke Blackwood, you are commanded to surrender your weapons and submit to royal custody pending investigation of charges related to conspiracy and treason. Kedrick looked past him toward the throne, where the king sat slumped and exhausted while the crown prince stood with his hand on the armrest like he was already claiming ownership. Behind them, half hidden in the shadows near a side entrance, Lord Chancellor Marius watched with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, but definitely not surprise. He had known. Of course he had known. This entire sequence had been orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how Kedrick thought and had constructed a trap that used his own strategy against him. Bring him to the capital. Dangle evidence of Marius's crimes. Let him believe he was coordinating the attack. Then spring the trap at the moment when he was most committed and most vulnerable. Elegant, ruthless, and absolutely fatal if he did not find a way out in the next 30 seconds. Kedrick released his sword belt and let it fall to the floor with a metallic sound that echoed through the throne room. Nobles who had been standing frozen in shock stepped back, giving the guards space to work. I submit to royal authority, Kedrick said clearly, and I invoke my right as a duke to demand formal trial before the full council rather than summary judgment. The crown prince glanced toward Marius, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Your request is acknowledged, the prince said. You will be held in the royal tower pending trial. The charges will be formally presented within 3 days. Kedrick allowed himself to be led from the throne room in chains while the entire court watched. Some nobles looked sympathetic. Most looked relieved. A few looked hungry, like predators who had just watched a rival get taken down and were already calculating how to claim his territory. This was what betrayal looked like from the inside, not the dramatic confrontation people imagined, not the emotional revelation where enemies gloated and explained their plans. Just the cold bureaucratic machinery of power consuming someone who had miscalculated the distance between hunter and hunted. The guards led him through marble corridors and up stone stairs into the royal tower, where prisoners of significant rank were held when the crown wanted to make examples of them publicly. The cell was better than dungeon accommodations, but not by much. Stone walls, a narrow window overlooking the courtyard, a bed that was technically a bed, but would not be comfortable for anyone who had gotten accustomed to actual furniture. They removed his chains but left 2 guards posted outside the door. Kedrick stood at the window and looked down at the courtyard where servants were preparing for tonight's banquet that would proceed exactly as planned because royal celebrations did not stop just because nobles got arrested for treason. Corvin appeared 30 minutes later, escorted by guards but not in chains himself. They allowed him 5 minutes, which meant someone had decided his continued freedom was more useful than his imprisonment, probably because they thought he would lead them to other conspirators, or because keeping one member of Kedrick's household functional was necessary for managing the duchy during the transition. My lord, Corvin began. Kedrick held up one hand. We are being listened to. Everything you say will be recorded and analyzed. Speak carefully. Corvin nodded. The charges are conspiracy to commit treason through coordination with Lady Ashford and Lord Pemberton to present false evidence against Lord Chancellor Marius. The Crown claims you were attempting to eliminate the Lord Chancellor in order to destabilize the succession and position yourself for territorial expansion during the resulting chaos. Evidence? Documents allegedly found in Lord Pemberton's estate showing communication between all 3 of you regarding timing and strategy. Financial records suggesting you funded Lady Ashford's intelligence network. Testimony from servants claiming to have witnessed meetings that were not publicly acknowledged. All fabricated. Yes, my lord, but fabricated well enough to pass initial scrutiny, and more importantly, fabricated in a way that uses your actual actions against you. You did meet with Lady Ashford. You did coordinate with her. The fact that your actual purpose was different from what they are claiming will be nearly impossible to prove now that the narrative has been established publicly. Kedrick turned from the window. Where is Lady Ashford being held? The lower cells. Standard confinement for accused traitors of non-ducal rank. In Pemberton? Same location. He claims complete ignorance of any conspiracy and says he was approached by intermediaries claiming to represent your interests but never met with you directly. Convenient. Yes, my lord. Kedrick walked the length of the cell. 8 paces. The kind of distance you measure when you are trying to maintain calm through physical movement, because standing still means confronting. The reality that you have been comprehensively outmaneuvered by people who understood your methods better than you understood theirs. This was Marius's work, had to be. No one else had the resources or the patience to construct something this sophisticated. He had anticipated Kedrick's investigation, had known about Alara's approach, had probably been feeding her information through intermediaries she believed were independent sources. And then, when everything was positioned correctly, he had simply reported the conspiracy to the Crown Prince and let royal authority do what his own operatives could not accomplish safely. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And Kedrick had walked into it because he had been arrogant enough to believe that understanding the game meant he could not be beaten at it. How long until trial? He asked. 3 days by royal decree. But my lord, 3 days is not the real timeline. The king is dying faster than anyone anticipated. If he passes before the trial concludes, the Crown Prince assumes full authority immediately and can pronounce judgment without council oversight, which means I have perhaps 48 hours before this shifts from formal proceeding to political execution. That is my assessment. Options. Corvin was silent for several seconds. Very few, my lord. Escape would require resources we do not have access to inside the royal tower. Legal defense requires evidence we cannot produce because the fabricated documents are designed to look more legitimate than the truth. Political intervention requires allies willing to risk opposing the Crown Prince during succession, and most of your former allies are currently deciding whether supporting you is worth becoming the next target. He paused. There is one possibility. If Lady Ashford can be convinced to testify that she was working alone and you were not actually coordinating with her, it removes the conspiracy element and reduces your charges to poor judgment rather than active treason. She will not do that. If she testifies against me, it confirms I am guilty. If she testifies for me, it confirms she is guilty, and I walked into an obvious trap which makes me look incompetent. Either way, Marius wins. Then I do not have a solution, my lord. Kedrick looked at Corvin. The man had served him for 8 years, had helped execute his brother, had coordinated intelligence networks across 3 territories, had never once questioned orders or hesitated when violence was necessary. And now he was standing in a prison cell, admitting there was no clear path forward. That was how you knew the situation was actually fatal. When people who had survived impossible circumstances with you could not identify a way out. Leave, Kedrick said. Return to Thornmarch. Make sure the duchy remains functional, regardless of what happens here. If I am executed, you will receive final instructions through the usual channels regarding succession and asset distribution. My lord, that is an order, Corvin. Leave while you still can. Staying here just means Marius will eventually decide you are a loose end and have you eliminated as well. Corvin bowed and left without further argument. Kedrick returned to the window. Below in the courtyard, servants continued their work. Wagons arrived with supplies. Guards changed shifts. Life ground forward with complete indifference to the fact that one of the most powerful men in the kingdom was currently locked in a tower cell, waiting for a trial that would almost certainly end in execution. This was the reality of power once you stripped away all the ceremonies and the formal titles, and the illusion that authority came from anything except the willingness to destroy anyone who challenged it. You could spend years building that authority, could execute your own family to protect it, could make yourself the most feared person in multiple territories. And then one woman with the right information and the wrong loyalties could walk into your life, convince you she was an ally, and lead you directly into a trap that used your own capabilities against you so efficiently that by the time you realized what had happened, you were already chained and waiting for judgment. The worst part was not even the betrayal itself. It was the recognition that Alara had never actually lied to him. She had told him exactly what she was. Someone hunting Marius using whatever tools were available. She had warned him that he could not be certain whether she was playing him, had explicitly stated that he would only know if she was trustworthy after Marius was dead, and they saw whether she honored their agreement. Kedrick had simply assumed he would have time to test that loyalty before it mattered. He had been wrong, and now he was locked in a cell while Marius walked free, and the woman who had positioned him for destruction sat in a dungeon, probably congratulating herself on executing a strategy that had worked exactly as planned. Except something about that analysis felt incomplete. Elara was in chains too. If this had been entirely her plan, she would have arranged to walk away clean while he took the fall. But she was implicated in the same conspiracy, would face the same charges, would potentially be executed alongside him, unless that was also part of the strategy. Unless being imprisoned together was designed to make him believe they were on the same side so that when the interrogations began, he would not immediately accuse her of orchestration. Or unless she actually had been planning to move against Marius and someone else had betrayed both of them to the Crown Prince, using their coordination as evidence of conspiracy while eliminating two threats simultaneously. Cedric sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands. This was the problem with operating at the level where everyone was constantly betraying everyone else. You reached a point where trust became impossible because every explanation was equally plausible, and verification required information you no longer had access to. He could assume Elara had betrayed him and plan accordingly, or he could assume they had both been betrayed by someone else and plan for cooperation. Or he could assume this was multi-layered manipulation where even the appearance of mutual betrayal was designed to confuse him. And he had approximately 48 hours to figure out which version of reality was accurate before it stopped mattering because he would be dead regardless. The guards changed shifts outside his door. Evening fell across the capital. Somewhere below in the palace, nobles were sitting down to the birthday banquet that had continued exactly as scheduled because royal celebrations were more important than minor inconveniences, like arresting dukes for treason. Cedric lay on the narrow bed and stared at stone ceiling and thought about all the choices that had brought him to this specific moment. Executing his brother had seemed necessary at the time, but it had also created the reputation that made him valuable to Marius as an example of ruthless efficiency. And that value had made him interesting to Elara as a potential weapon. And that interest had created the opening for this trap to be constructed. Cause and effect, action and consequence. The fundamental structure of power was that every choice you made created the circumstances that would eventually destroy you. And the only question was whether you survived long enough to see it coming or whether you died. Surprised that the thing you thought was strength had actually been weakness all along. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Cedric did not sleep. Could not sleep. His mind kept cycling through scenarios and counter-scenarios and contingencies that all led to the same conclusion. He was comprehensively trapped by someone who had understood his methods better than he understood himself. Then at approximately 2 hours past midnight, the door opened. Not guards. Elara Ashford stepped into the cell wearing the same green dress from the arrest, but now stained and torn. Her hands were still chained. Her face showed fresh bruises. Someone had interrogated her and not been gentle about it. Behind her, a guard Cedric did not recognize closed the door and took up position outside. She stood just inside the doorway looking at him with an expression that was impossible to read. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Elara said, "We need to talk." Cedric stood slowly. "If you are here to explain why you betrayed me, you can save your breath. I already understand the strategy. It was efficient. I would have done the same in your position. I did not betray you. Everyone says that when they get caught. I am not caught. I am exactly where I plan to be. In chains? In a cell? Facing execution in 48 hours? She walked to the window and looked out at the same courtyard Cedric had been studying for hours. Facing execution is not the same as being executed, and everything that has happened so far is exactly what needed to happen for the next phase to work. Cedric laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. You are claiming this was all planned? Being arrested? Being charged with treason? Watching our entire strategy collapse in front of the entire court? Not our strategy. Their strategy, Marius's strategy, which we needed to let play out completely so we could identify everyone involved and understand the full scope of his network. She turned to face him. You think small, Duke. You wanted to destroy Marius. I wanted to destroy the entire system that produced him. The Royal Council, the Crown Prince's advisors, every corrupt official who has spent 20 years building power through manipulation and murder. You cannot do that by arresting one man. You do it by letting him believe he has won so thoroughly that he stops being careful and exposes everyone he has been protecting. This is insane. This is necessary. And the fact that you cannot see the difference is why you were always going to lose if you operated alone. Kedrick walked toward her slowly. If this is actually your plan, then you are either a genius or you have convinced yourself that desperate improvisation looks like strategy when viewed from inside a prison cell. Elara held up her chained hands. These were not locked by the guards who arrested me. They were locked by the guard who just brought me here. A guard I have been paying for 18 months to be exactly where he needs to be at exactly the right moment. He is one of 16 people I have positioned inside the palace infrastructure who have been waiting for this specific sequence to occur. She lowered her hands. Tomorrow morning, the king will die. Not naturally. But it will look natural because the physicians who examine him are 3 of my 16 people. The Crown Prince will assume emergency authority and announce an accelerated trial schedule for all prisoners accused of treason. He will demand immediate judgments to demonstrate strength during the transition. And that helps us how? Because when he announces the accelerated schedule, 4 members of the Royal Council will object on procedural grounds. That objection will force an emergency session where the full evidence against Marius must be presented publicly before any trials can proceed. And during that session, my people will provide documentation proving that Marius orchestrated not just our arrests, but also the king's death. You're talking about killing the king. I am talking about doing what needed to be done 2 years ago when my father discovered the same corruption and was executed before he could act. I am finishing what he started. And you are going to help me because the alternative is dying in 3 days for crimes you did not commit while Marius walks away clean. Kedrick studied her face, looking for the lie. For the moment when the performance cracked and revealed what was actually underneath, he found nothing except absolute conviction, which meant she was either telling the truth or she was the most accomplished liar he had ever encountered, and he was about to make the worst decision of his life by believing her. If I help you with this, he said slowly, and it turns out you are lying, I will kill you myself before they execute either of us. Do you understand that? Completely. And if you are telling the truth, and this actually works, you will owe me a debt that I will collect in ways you will not enjoy. I would expect nothing less. Then tell me exactly what you need me to do. Elara smiled. It was cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. I need you to stop thinking like a duke who rules through fear and start thinking like a person who understands that the only way to destroy a system is to burn it down from the inside while everyone is watching and make them believe they are witnessing justice instead of revolution. She walked to the door and knocked twice. The guard opened it immediately. You have until dawn to decide, she said. After that, events move forward with or without your cooperation. Choose correctly, Duke. This is the only chance either of us gets to survive what comes next. Then she was gone, leaving Kedrick alone in the cell with the weight of a decision that would either save him or ensure his death was even more public and humiliating than Marius had originally planned. He returned to the window. Below in the courtyard, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Somewhere in this palace, a king was dying or about to die depending on whether Elara was telling the truth. Somewhere else, Marius was probably sleeping soundly believing he had won. And somewhere in the space between those two realities, Kedrick Blackwood stood in a prison cell, having to choose between trusting a woman who had every reason to destroy him and accepting certain death because the alternative seemed impossible. This was what power actually looked like at the end. Not the moment of victory, but the moment right before everything collapsed, when you had to decide whether falling meant dying or whether it meant transforming into something that could survive the impact. Kedrick made his choice, not because he trusted Elara, but because dying on his knees waiting for judgment was not acceptable when dying on his feet trying to burn everything down was still available as an option. And if she was lying, if this was all just elaborate manipulation designed to extract his cooperation before his execution, then at least he would know with certainty that the woman who destroyed him was genuinely extraordinary. That was worth something. Not much. But in the calculus of men facing annihilation, you took whatever small victories remained available and called them meaning. Dawn broke over the capital, and in the royal chambers, exactly as Elara had predicted, the king stopped breathing. The bells began ringing at dawn, not the celebratory peals that marked royal birthdays or military victories. The slow, measured tolling that meant only one thing. The king was dead, and the kingdom was now in the hands of whoever could seize control before anyone else realized what was happening. Kedrick stood at his cell window watching the capital wake to the news. Servants rushed between buildings. Guards assembled in courtyard formations. Nobles who had been sleeping off last night's banquet stumbled into corridors demanding information from anyone who looked like they might have answers. Chaos. Perfect, beautiful chaos. The kind of environment where careful plans dissolved and people made mistakes because they were operating on instinct instead of strategy. Alara had been right about the timing, which meant either her network was actually as sophisticated as she claimed, or she had gotten extraordinarily lucky with her predictions. Kedrick suspected the former but was prepared for the latter because luck could turn against you just as quickly as it turned in your favor. The door to his cell opened without warning. Not the guard from last night. A different man wearing royal livery but with eyes that tracked Kedrick's movements the way soldiers tracked threats instead of prisoners. One of Alara's people, then, positioned exactly where he needed to be at exactly the right moment. The Crown Prince has called an emergency council session, the guard said quietly. All prisoners accused of treason are to be brought to the throne room for immediate judgment. You have approximately 10 minutes before the escort arrives. Use them. He stepped aside, revealing the corridor beyond. Empty. No other guards visible. Kedrick did not hesitate. He walked out of the cell and followed the guard through passages that should have been crowded with palace staff, but were somehow clear. Someone had coordinated this perfectly, timing the king's death to coincide with shift changes, ensuring specific guards were positioned at specific checkpoints, creating corridors of opportunity through what should have been impossible security. They descended stone stairs into sections of the palace Kedrick had never accessed, service corridors where actual work happened away from the marble halls, where nobles pretended civilization required elaborate furniture. The guard led him through 3 more turns and then stopped at an unmarked door. Inside, Alara was waiting. She had changed clothes. Now wore dark pants and a leather coat that looked functional rather than decorative. Her hair was tied back. The chains were gone. She looked like someone preparing for violence instead of courtroom drama. Good, she said when she saw him. You are not as stupid as most dukes who think authority protects them from reality. Kedrick closed the door. Your guard said 10 minutes. Start talking. The Crown Prince will convene the council and demand immediate trials to demonstrate strength during the transition. Lord Chancellor Marius will support this because he believes accelerated proceedings favor him. 4 council members will object because they are mine, and I told them to object. That objection will force presentation of evidence. And during that presentation, we will provide proof that Marius not only orchestrated our arrest, but also poisoned the king to accelerate the succession. You keep saying you have proof. I want to see it. Alara pulled documents from inside her coat and spread them on a wooden table that looked like it was usually used for food preparation. Financial records, correspondence, testimony statements, and at the center of it all, a vial containing residue of the same poison that had killed Kedrick's father 8 years ago. The physicians who examined the king this morning found traces of this compound in his system, Alara said. It accelerates heart failure in a way that looks like natural death, unless you know what to test for. Marius has been administering it through the royal wine steward for the past 6 weeks. Slowly, carefully, timing the king's death to coincide with our arrests so the crisis would force the crown prince to act decisively without proper investigation. And you can prove the wine steward was working for Marius? She pointed to specific documents, payment records showing transfers from Marius's private accounts to the steward's family. Letters discussing timing and dosage written in code but decipherable with the key I acquired from Marius's personal secretary, who is currently being held in protective custody by my people. Your people keep expanding. How many exactly do you have inside this palace? Enough. The question is not whether I have resources. The question is whether you are actually committed to using them or whether you are going to hesitate at the critical moment because burning down the entire power structure feels too extreme. Kedrick studied the documents. Everything looked legitimate, well-constructed. The kind of evidence that could destroy Marius if presented correctly, but could also be dismissed as fabrication if the crown prince decided protecting the Lord Chancellor was more important than justice. This only works if the council believes it, he said. If they think we fabricated evidence to save ourselves, Marius walks away and we die anyway. Which is why we are not presenting it to the council first. We are presenting it to the people. Alara walked to a second door and opened it. Beyond was a narrow passage that led toward sounds of crowd noise. She gestured for him to follow. They emerged into a servant's alcove overlooking the palace's main public square. Below, Thousands of citizens had gathered in response to the bells announcing the king's death. Merchants, laborers, families. The actual population of the capital who never attended court functions but whose lives were shaped by decisions made in throne rooms they would never see. Marius expects this to be handled quietly in council chambers, Alara continued. He expects political maneuvering and backroom deals and the usual process where justice is negotiated by people who benefit from protecting each other. But if we take this directly to the public first, if we show them proof that their king was murdered by his own Lord Chancellor, the council will have no choice but to act because refusing would look like complicity. That is not justice. That is mob rule. It is survival. And you do not have the luxury of being particular about methods when you are hours away from execution. She was right. Cedric hated that she was right, but could not identify a flaw in the logic. Traditional authority had already failed. The crown prince was too weak to act without external pressure. The council was too compromised to deliver justice through normal channels, which left the ugly reality that sometimes the only way to force powerful people to do the right thing was to make doing the wrong thing more dangerous than doing nothing. How do we address them? He asked. The square is surrounded by royal guards who will not let accused traitors walk out and start making speeches. We do not walk out. We project out. Alara pointed to the palace walls where enormous tapestries hung displaying royal crests and ceremonial imagery. Someone is currently preparing to replace one of those tapestries with a screen. And on that screen, we are going to display every piece of evidence against Marius, while you and I stand here and explain exactly what it means. The crowd will see it. The council will be forced to respond. And Marius will have approximately 5 minutes to either flee or face judgment in front of witnesses who actually care whether they're rulers or murderers. This is insane. This is revolution, and revolution is always insane right up until the moment it works. Then it is called justice, and people pretend it was inevitable. She pulled 2 more items from inside her coat. A blade, a loaded crossbow. She offered him the blade. In case things go badly, she said, you seem like someone who prefers dying with a weapon in hand rather than waiting for execution. Cedric took the blade. It was well balanced, sharp. The kind of weapon that could kill efficiently if used correctly. If this goes badly, he said, I am not dying alone. Understood? Completely. Then let us burn everything down and see what survives. The tapestry came down at precisely the moment Alara had predicted, replaced by white fabric that could serve as a projection screen using equipment that was apparently already in position because her network had been preparing for this specific scenario for months. Below in the square, the crowd noticed immediately. People pointed, shouted questions. Guards tried to restore order but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Then the first image appeared on the screen. Financial records showing payments from Marius to the wine steward. Clear, detailed. Large enough that even people at the back of the square could read the amounts and dates. The crowd went silent. Alara's voice cut through that silence, amplified by equipment Cedric could not see but could hear perfectly. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had practiced this speech repeatedly and knew exactly which words would land hardest. Citizens of the capital, what you are seeing is proof that Lord Chancellor Marius poisoned King Edmund, not quickly, not obviously, but slowly over 6 weeks while pretending to serve the crown faithfully. He murdered your king to control the succession, to ensure the crown prince would be weak and manageable, to transform this kingdom into his personal territory where justice is whatever serves his interests. More images appeared. Letters. Testimony statements. The vial of poison held up to light so everyone could see it. The crowd started to react, not with riot energy yet, but with the low rumble of thousands of people simultaneously realizing they had been lied to by the same authorities they were supposed to trust. Inside the palace, Cedric knew the council was scrambling. Emergency meetings were being called. Guards were being dispatched to shut down the projection. Marius was probably screaming at subordinates demanding they stop this before it destroyed everything he had built. But stopping it required coordinating response faster than events were unfolding. And Alara had structured this specifically to move faster than institutional reaction time. That was the genius of it, not the evidence itself, though that was compelling. But the speed, the public presentation, the way it forced people to choose sides before they had time to calculate which side was safer. Cedric stepped into view beside Alara. The crowd recognized him immediately. The Duke of Thornmarch, the man who executed his own brother, standing beside the daughter of a traitor. speaking directly to common people instead of going through proper channels. "I am Duke Cadric Blackwood," he said, "and I was arrested yesterday for conspiracy against the crown. The charges were fabricated by the same man who killed your king. Lord Chancellor Marius has spent 20 years building power through manipulation and murder. He destroys anyone who threatens his control. He corrupted the royal council. He executed loyal nobles on false charges. And now he has killed the king himself to ensure the succession serves his purposes instead of the kingdom's interests." His voice carried across the square with the authority of someone who had spent years commanding soldiers and knew how to project power through words alone. But here's what Marius did not anticipate. He did not anticipate that some of us would rather die exposing him than live under his authority. He did not anticipate that corruption eventually becomes so obvious that even careful conspirators leave traces. And he definitely did not anticipate that the daughter of a man he murdered would spend 2 years building a network specifically designed to destroy him. More images flashed across the screen, each one more damning than the last. The crowd's rumble was growing louder, angrier. Guards at the square's perimeter were looking uncertain. Some were still maintaining order. Others were stepping back. A few were actively leaving their positions. That was the moment when everything tipped from controlled presentation into genuine threat. Because once the people responsible for maintaining order started questioning whether the orders they were following were legitimate, authority collapsed faster than anyone could rebuild it. Inside the palace, doors slammed open. Crown Prince Edmund II appeared on a balcony overlooking the square, accompanied by Lord Chancellor Marius and 6 royal guards. The prince looked panicked. Marius looked calm in the way of people who had survived too many political crises to panic visibly, regardless of how desperate circumstances actually were. The prince raised his hand, demanding silence. The crowd ignored him. He tried to speak, but his voice did not carry the way Cadric's had. He was used to rooms where everyone was already listening, not squares filled with thousands of people who had just been told their king was murdered. Marius stepped forward and spoke instead. His voice was trained, professional, the voice of someone who had spent decades commanding attention in difficult circumstances. "Citizens, you are being manipulated by accused traitors who are attempting to avoid justice by creating false narratives. These documents are fabrications. These accusations are desperate inventions by people who know they are guilty and are trying to deflect blame. Do not be deceived by spectacle masquerading as truth." But his words landed differently than he expected, because the crowd was not looking at him. They were looking at the projection screen where new images were appearing. Not just financial records now, actual correspondence in Marius's handwriting. Letters discussing the king's declining health with satisfaction. Instructions to the wine steward about dosage timing. References to accelerating the succession before opposition could organize. Evidence so specific and so obviously authentic that denying it required believing in conspiracies more elaborate than simply accepting the obvious truth that the man speaking to them had murdered their king. The crowd's energy shifted from rumble to roar. Guards at the perimeter were now openly abandoning their positions. Some were moving toward the palace entrance instead of away from it. That was the moment Cadric had been waiting for. The moment when institutional authority fractured and people started making individual choices about which side of history they wanted to be on when this was finished. He turned to Alara. "Time to move." She nodded, and they left the alcove, moving through passages that led directly toward the throne room. Behind them, they could hear the crowd surging forward. Not organized, not coordinated. Just thousands of people simultaneously deciding that the man on the balcony needed to answer for what he had done, and they were not going to wait for official proceedings. This was the dangerous part, not the presentation. That had been relatively controlled. But this moment when angry people with legitimate grievances started making decisions about justice without institutional oversight. That was when revolution stopped being about changing systems and started being about simple violence against anyone associated with the old order. Cadric and Alara reached the throne room through a side entrance just as the main doors burst open. Not the crowd yet. Royal guards. But led by a captain, Cadric recognized as one of the men who had hesitated during his arrest. The captain looked at them both, looked at the chaos visible through windows overlooking the square, looked at the crown prince and Marius, who were now retreating from the balcony as the crowd noise intensified. Then he made his choice. He lowered his sword and stepped aside. Other guards followed his lead. Not all of them. 3 remained loyal to Marius and moved to intercept. But 3 guards against a captain and 15 others who had just switched sides was not a fight. It was a brief exchange of steel that ended with two of the loyal guards disarmed, and the third bleeding on marble, while servants screamed and ran for exits. The crown prince stumbled backward until he hit the throne, sat down hard, looked at Ceadric with eyes that were no longer seeing a duke, but seeing someone who had just torn apart the entire structure of authority the prince had been taught to believe was permanent. Marius did not run, did not even move, just stood perfectly still watching Ceadric and Alara approach while the sounds of the mob grew louder outside. This was what the end of power actually looked like. Not dramatic confrontation, not clever final words. Just a man standing in a throne room realizing that all the carefully constructed alliances and paid loyalties and strategic positioning meant nothing when the fundamental structure they were built on collapsed. "You think this is victory?" Marius said quietly. "You think you have won because you turned people against me. But all you have done is prove that civilization is one angry mob away from barbarism. You have not created justice. You have created chaos that will consume this kingdom worse than anything I ever did." "Maybe," Ceadric said, "but at least it will be honest chaos, not corruption dressed as order, not murder disguised as politics. Just the violent truth that power built on lies eventually falls apart and takes everyone nearby with it." He drew the blade Alara had given him. The crown prince stood from the throne, tried to assert authority that no longer existed. "I command you to stop. I am your king now. You will obey royal authority." Ceadric ignored him entirely, kept his eyes on Marius. "This is what you created," he said. "You spent 20 years convincing everyone that rules did not matter, that loyalty was just leverage, that human life was resources to be managed. You destroyed the mechanisms that keep civilization from becoming slaughter, and now you are surprised that those same tools are being used against you. I did what was necessary to keep this kingdom stable. You did what was convenient to keep yourself powerful. There is a difference, and the fact that you cannot see it is exactly why you need to die." Marius smiled. It was cold and empty. "If you kill me here, you prove I was right all along. That power is just violence dressed in different clothing. That justice is whatever the person with the weapon says it is." "Yes," Ceadric said. "Exactly." He drove the blade through Marius's chest before the man could react. Clean, efficient, the way he had been trained to kill when killing needed to happen quickly and without ceremony. Marius's expression did not change, just looked down at the blade protruding from his ribs like he was observing something interesting rather than dying. "You will regret this," he whispered. "Not now, but eventually, when you realize that destroying me made you exactly what I was." Then he collapsed. The throne room went absolutely silent. The crown prince stared at the body, at Ceadric, at the guards who had allowed this to happen. His face showed the progressive stages of realization that everything he thought he knew about how power worked had just been proven wrong in the most violent way possible. Outside, the mob had reached the palace entrance. Doors were being forced open. Windows were shattering. The sound of thousands of people flooding into corridors built to impress them with majesty they could never possess. Alara moved to stand beside Ceadric. Together, they turned to face the crown prince, who was now technically king, but looked like a child who had just watched his entire world burn down. "You have a choice," Alara said to him. "You can try to restore order through the traditional methods that just failed catastrophically. Arrest us, restore the council, pretend this was an isolated incident instead of systematic corruption. Or you can acknowledge that the old system is dead and use this moment to build something different." The new king looked between them, between the body of his Lord Chancellor, between the sound of his palace being overrun by citizens who had just learned their ruler was murdered by the people claiming to serve him. "What are you proposing?" he said finally. "Truth," Ceadric answered. "Actual investigations of council corruption. Public trials for anyone complicit in Marius's crimes. Reforms that give people who are not nobles a voice in how they are governed. Not because it is just or moral or any of the pleasant lies people tell themselves, but because the alternative is civil war that will destroy everything regardless of who wins. And if I refuse, then we leave right now and let the mob decide what justice looks like. And I promise you will not survive what they choose." The king looked at his empty throne, at the guards who had betrayed their oaths, at the reality that authority was not something granted by titles or bloodlines, but something that existed only as long as people chose to recognize it. Slowly he nodded. "Help me restore order. Help me investigate. Help me rebuild this kingdom into something that might actually survive longer than my father's administration. And in return, I will acknowledge you were acting to expose genuine treason rather than committing it. Kadric exchanged a glance with Alara. This was the moment, the decision point where they either accepted partial victory and worked within remaining structures or rejected everything and let chaos run its full course. She nodded slightly. He turned back to the king. Agreed. But understand this. If you backtrack, if you protect the remaining corrupt officials because they are politically convenient, if you return to the same methods that produced Marius, I will come back and finish what I started today. Are we clear? The king met his eyes. For the first time, there was something resembling actual strength in his expression instead of fear masquerading as authority. Clear. The mob burst into the throne room before anyone could say anything else. Hundreds of people flooding through doors that guards no longer defended. They saw Marius's body, saw the king standing beside the throne, saw Kadric and Alara still holding weapons. For several seconds, the crowd hesitated. This was the moment that would determine everything. Whether the energy became focused reform or unfocused slaughter. Whether people who had been given the truth about their king's murder would accept systematic justice or demand immediate revenge on everyone associated with the old regime. Kadric stepped forward. "Your king is dead," he said loudly. "Murdered by the man whose body lies here. Lord Chancellor Marius poisoned King Edmund to control the succession. We have proof. Evidence that will be presented publicly in trials beginning tomorrow. Justice will be served, but it will be served through investigation and law, not through violence that makes us identical to the corruption we are trying to eliminate." Someone in the crowd shouted. Then another. Arguments breaking out about whether to believe him or whether this was just another manipulation. The new king stepped forward beside Kadric, spoke with more confidence than he had shown yet. Duke Blackwood and Lady Ashford acted to expose treason at the highest levels of this government. They risked their lives to provide truth when those of us in power were too blind or too compromised to see it. I am declaring their arrests void and their accusations validated. Beginning tomorrow, we will conduct open investigations into every official Marius corrupted. Every crime will be examined. Every guilty party will face judgment. This I swear on my father's memory. The crowd's energy began to shift, still angry, still volatile, but moving from immediate violence toward something that looked more like focused demand for accountability. Alara moved to join them, held up documents for the crowd to see. Everything is here. Names, evidence, proof of who participated and who knew and did nothing. It will all be made public. No secrets. No protection for the powerful. Real justice for the first time in a generation. That was the moment the mob became something else. Not exactly orderly, but channeled, directed toward outcomes that involved trials instead of executions, evidence instead of accusations, the kind of controlled chaos that sometimes produced actual reform instead of just replacing one tyrant with another. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, not leaving entirely, but pulling back from the immediate crisis, waiting to see if promises made in throne rooms during emergencies would actually be kept when the crisis passed and the normal calculations of power resumed. Kadric felt the tension in his shoulders begin to release. They had survived. Not won completely, not secured everything, but survived the immediate moment when survival had seemed impossible. He looked at Alara. She was watching the crowd with the same careful attention he was, both of them understanding that this was not the end, just the beginning of a much longer process where the revolution they had started would either transform into lasting change or collapse back into the same corruption with different names. "We should leave," she said quietly, "before someone decides we are too dangerous to keep alive, even if we just save the kingdom." Agreed. They walked from the throne room side by side through corridors where palace staff were slowly emerging from hiding, through the main courtyard where citizens were still gathered but no longer threatening immediate violence, through the gates and into streets where the capital was beginning its strange return to normal despite everything that had just happened. 3 blocks from the palace, Alara stopped. "You know this is not finished," she said. "I know. The king is weak. The council is compromised. The reforms he promised will face resistance from every noble who benefits from the current system. Within 6 months, they will either try to reverse everything or they will try to eliminate us as threats to stability." "I know that too. So what do we do?" Kadric looked back toward the palace, visible above the city rooftops, at the screen where evidence had been projected, at the square where thousands of people had just learned their government had been murdering them quietly for decades. We do what we have always done, he said. We survive. We adapt. And we make sure that anyone who tries to return to the old system understands exactly how much they will lose if they succeed. He turned to face her directly. You were right about one thing. I was thinking too small, trying to maintain power through fear in a single duchy while the kingdom collapsed around me. But you have shown me something different, not better necessarily, but different. A way to operate that uses truth as a weapon instead of always hiding behind lies and manipulation. She smiled slightly. Careful, Duke. You're starting to sound like someone who believes in things beyond personal survival. That is dangerous territory. Maybe. But I've spent 8 years surviving, and it has gotten me exactly nowhere except locked in cells waiting for execution. Perhaps dangerous territory is exactly where I need to be. They stood in silence for several seconds. Around them, the capital continued its strange transformation. People emerging from homes, merchants reopening shops, life resuming its patterns while everything fundamental had changed. Then Alara said, "We should get out of the capital, tonight, before people start asking detailed questions about how we coordinated everything, before the council decides we are too destabilizing to remain free." Where do we go? Thornmarch. You still control the north, and I just acquired claims to my family's former territories through restoration of our titles. Together, that gives us leverage to ensure the reforms actually happen. We become the external pressure keeping the crown honest while it tries to rebuild legitimacy. And if the crown decides external pressure is just rebellion waiting to happen, then we become rebellion and finish what we started today. But this time we do it properly, not mob justice, not palace coups, actual systematic dismantling of every corrupt structure that produced people like Marius. Kedrick considered this. Everything she said made sense strategically. Leave the capital before becoming convenient scapegoats. Consolidate power in territories they actually controlled. Position themselves as essential to stability while maintaining enough independence that cooperation remained voluntary instead of compulsory. It was smart. It was also exactly the kind of plan that could transform into something much bigger and much more dangerous if circumstances pushed them toward harder choices. But maybe that was acceptable. Maybe the kingdom needed people willing to make those choices, since everyone else had proven they would rather maintain comfortable corruption than risk genuine change. Agreed, he said. We leave tonight. We consolidate. We give the king 6 months to prove he meant what he said. And if he fails, we return with enough force that no one mistakes our intentions. Then we have an alliance. More than an alliance, Kedrick said. We have a purpose, something neither of us has had in years beyond simple survival. That might be worth the risk. She extended her hand. He took it. Not the formal handshake from before, but the grip of two people who had just burned down an empire together and were now committed to whatever came next. They released and walked together through streets that were slowly returning to normal, while the palace, behind them, tried to comprehend how completely everything had changed in the span of a single morning. This was what revolution actually looked like after the dramatic moments passed. Not clean victory, not immediate transformation, just two people walking through a city that still did not fully understand what had happened, carrying weapons they might still need, heading toward territories where they would have to defend what they had started against everyone who wanted to undo it. But at least they were walking towards something instead of standing still waiting for destruction to arrive. At least they had proven that power built entirely on fear and manipulation could be torn down by people willing to risk everything on the possibility that truth was stronger than lies. Whether that was actually true remained to be seen. But Kedrick Blackwood was done waiting to find out. He had spent 8 years surviving. Now he was going to see if he could actually live. And if that meant burning down everything else in the process, so be it. The kingdom would either rebuild better or it would burn completely. Either way, he would be standing at the center of it, instead of hiding in towers pretending isolation was safety. They reached the stables where horses were waiting. Alara's network had positioned everything perfectly one final time. Supplies, weapons, routes north that avoided major roads where royal patrols might intercept them. Kedrick mounted and looked back at the capital one last time. Somewhere in that palace, a new king was trying to figure out how to rule after everything his father had built was exposed as corrupt. Somewhere in those streets, thousands of citizens were trying to understand what justice looked like when the people claiming to provide it had just murdered their ruler. And somewhere in the ruins of the royal council, The remaining officials were calculating whether reform or retaliation would better serve their interests now that the most powerful man in the kingdom was dead. All of it balanced on the edge between transformation and collapse. All of it depending on whether the choices made in the next few weeks would push toward building something new or destroying what remained of the old. Cedric turned his horse north. Beside him, Alara did the same, and together they rode toward Thornmarch, while behind them the capital burned with questions that would not be answered until much later, when the true cost of what they had started became impossible to ignore. But that was a problem for another day. Today, they had survived. Tomorrow, they would see if survival was enough, or if the kingdom they had just torn apart would demand something more permanent from both of them before it allowed itself to be rebuilt. The journey north took 6 days through territories that had forgotten what peace looked like. Villages burned by bandits who thrived in the chaos following the king's death. Fields abandoned because farmers no longer believed anyone would protect them from the violence that erupted whenever central authority weakened. Roads crowded with refugees moving in every direction simultaneously, all of them searching for safety that did not exist anywhere. This was what happened when you tore down an empire without a plan for what came after. The void filled with the worst impulses humanity possessed, and the people who suffered most were the ones who had never asked for revolution in the first place. Cedric watched it all from horseback and understood with absolute clarity that he had created this. Not alone, but his actions in the capital had accelerated the collapse in ways that would take years to repair, if repair was even possible. Alara rode beside him in silence. They had barely spoken since leaving the capital. There was too much to process. Too many implications still revealing themselves as they moved through the wreckage of what their victory had produced. On the 4th day, they passed through a village that had been prosperous before. Market Square still intact, houses still standing, but empty, completely abandoned, doors hanging open, possessions scattered in streets like people had fled without warning. Cedric dismounted and walked through the silence, found evidence of recent occupation, fires and hearths that were only hours old. Food still on tables. Whatever had driven these people away had happened fast enough that they took nothing except their children and their lives. He stood in the empty square and felt the weight of it settling over him like ash from fires he had started without fully comprehending how far they would spread. "This is what justice looks like," Alara said quietly behind him. "When you strip away the performance and the rhetoric and the belief that destroying corrupt systems automatically produces better ones. This is the cost." He turned to face her. "Are you saying we were wrong?" "I am saying we were necessary, which is not the same as being right. Marius needed to die. The old system needed to collapse. But collapsing systems kill innocent people in the process, and we do not get to pretend that was unintended consequence instead of inevitable outcome." She walked to stand beside him in the center of the abandoned square. "My father understood this. Before he was executed, he told me that the difference between revolution and murder was whether you were willing to accept responsibility for the bodies that piled up in the pursuit of change. Most revolutionaries claim they are not responsible because their intentions were pure, but intentions do not rebuild villages or bring back the dead. So what do we do with that?" Cedric asked. "Live with the guilt? Pretend it was worth it? Tell ourselves that future generations will judge us kindly once they forget the specific people who died? We do something harder. We acknowledge that we became exactly what we destroyed. Killers who believed our violence was justified because it served a larger purpose. And then we decide whether to continue being that, or whether to transform into something capable of actually rebuilding instead of just tearing down." They stood together in silence while wind moved through empty buildings carrying the smell of abandonment and fear. Cedric had spent 8 years believing that power meant the ability to make hard choices without drowning in regret afterward. That ruthlessness was strength and hesitation was weakness, and the only thing that mattered was surviving long enough to impose your will on circumstances that would otherwise destroy you. But standing in this village, looking at the consequences of choices made in throne rooms by people who thought themselves important, he understood something he had been avoiding his entire adult life. Power was not the absence of consequences. It was the weight of carrying them forward into every subsequent decision until the accumulated mass became so heavy that you either collapsed under it or stopped feeling it entirely, and became the kind of monster who could walk through devastation without noticing the human cost. His father had been the latter. Marius had been the latter. Most rulers throughout history had been the latter because the alternative was confronting the reality that their authority was built on suffering. They could have prevented but chose not to because preventing it would have cost them something they valued more than other people's lives. Kaedric had been heading in that direction before the capital, before Alara, before being forced to make choices that revealed the distance between the person he thought he was and the person his actions actually demonstrated. "We rebuild," he said finally, "not because it absolves what we did, but because the alternative is letting this become permanent. We use whatever power we actually have to create stability that does not require constant violence to maintain. And when we fail, because we will fail, we try again instead of giving up and pretending failure was inevitable." Alara looked at him with something that might have been respect, or might have been recognition that they were both too damaged to achieve what they were describing, but were going to attempt it anyway. Because the alternative was unacceptable. "That is not going to make us popular," she said. "Reformers who acknowledge they are compromised by their own methods do not inspire loyalty the way tyrants or saints do. No. But maybe that is exactly what this kingdom needs. People willing to be unpopular while doing necessary work instead of performing righteousness for audiences who judge based on appearance rather than outcome." They remounted and continued north through landscapes that grew progressively more familiar as they approached Thornmarch. Hills Kaedric had ridden as a child, forests where he had learned to hunt, rivers that marked the boundaries of territory he had inherited and maintained through methods he was no longer certain he could justify even to himself. By the time they reached Blackthorn Keep, evening was falling across the northern territories. The fortress looked exactly as he had left it, dark stone against darker sky. Towers that had stood for centuries and would probably stand for centuries more, regardless of who ruled from them or what atrocities they committed in the name of order and stability. Corvin met them in this courtyard. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago, the kind of aging that came from stress rather than time. Behind him, household staff assembled in formations that suggested they had been preparing for this arrival and were uncertain whether to celebrate or mourn. "My lord," Corvin said, "news from the capital has been irregular but disturbing. We heard about the king's death, about Lord Chancellor Marius, about riots in the streets. I had begun to believe you were not returning." "I almost did not," Kaedric said, "but here we are. And now we have work to do that will make everything I have asked of you previously look simple by comparison." He dismounted and gestured for Alara to follow him inside. The Great Hall was exactly as he remembered, cold, imposing, designed to make visitors feel small and temporary, while the stone around them proclaimed permanence and authority that transcended individual rulers. Kaedric walked to the center of the hall and turned to face Corvin and the assembled staff. "Everything changes starting now," he said. "The Northern Territories are going to become a model for what reformed governance looks like. Transparent tax collection, public accounting of how revenue is spent, judicial processes that do not depend entirely on my personal judgment, land redistribution to families displaced by violence, investment in infrastructure that benefits common people instead of just nobles and merchants." He paused to let that settle. "This will be unpopular with every noble family who benefits from the current system. They will resist, they will conspire, and when resistance and conspiracy fail, they will attempt open rebellion. We are going to crush that rebellion so thoroughly that no one attempts it again. But we are going to do it through overwhelming demonstration of force, rather than through terror and random executions designed to create fear." Corvin's expression did not change, but Kaedric could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. This was not the Duke who had left for the capital, yet. This was someone who had been transformed by events in ways that would take time to fully understand. "My lord," Corvin said carefully, "what you are describing will require complete restructuring of administrative systems that have been in place for generations. It will alienate allies who expect you to maintain traditional arrangements, and it will make you vulnerable to accusations that you are destabilizing the region during an already volatile period." "Yes," Kaedric said, "all of that is accurate, and we are doing it anyway because the alternative is continuing to rule the way my father ruled and his father before him, through fear and manipulation and the assumption that common people exist to serve noble interests rather than the other way around." He looked at each person in the hall individually. "Anyone who cannot commit to this can leave now with recommendation letters and enough gold to establish themselves elsewhere. I am not interested in forcing loyalty through threats, but I am also not interested in half measures or people who will undermine reforms because they preferred the old system. Choose now. Stay and help build something different, or leave and find employment with dukes who still believe power means never having to justify your decisions to anyone." No one moved. Several long seconds passed. Then Corvin stepped forward and bowed formally. I have served this house for 18 years, my lord, through your father's rule and through yours. I have witnessed methods I disagreed with and participated in actions I am not proud of. If you're genuinely committed to transforming Thornmarch into something that serves its people, rather than simply extracting from them, then I will help you achieve that even if it costs me everything I have built. One by one, the other staff members stepped forward and made similar commitments. Not all of them. 3 servants quietly left the hall, and Kaedric made note of their names for Corvin to provide those recommendation letters. But most stayed, which was more than he had expected given how radical the changes he was proposing actually were. Elara watched the entire exchange without speaking. When the hall had cleared and only the 3 of them remained, she finally said, "That was either genuinely transformative leadership or the most sophisticated manipulation I have seen in years. I genuinely cannot tell which." "Neither can I," Kaedric admitted. "But I meant every word, even if I do not yet know how to implement any of it without creating new problems that are just as bad as the ones we are trying to solve. That is more honesty than most rulers ever achieve. It might be enough. Or it might be the beginning of failure that costs more lives than Marius ever destroyed. But at least it will be failure in pursuit of something better instead of success at perpetuating inherited evil." They stood together in the empty hall, while firelight from the hearths cast shadows that made the ancient stones look almost alive. Witnessing, judging, carrying the weight of every decision made within these walls by people who had all believed they were doing what was necessary. Kaedric wondered how many of those people had stood exactly where he was standing now and told themselves they would be different, that they would avoid the mistakes of their predecessors, that their authority would be wielded with wisdom instead of just force. Probably all of them. And most had been wrong. But maybe the difference this time was that he was not claiming to be different, just committed to attempting something that would probably fail but needed to be attempted anyway because the alternative was accepting that nothing ever changed and power always corrupted exactly the same way regardless of individual intentions. The next 6 months were harder than the revolution had been. Revolution was dramatic. Revolution had clear enemies and obvious victories and moments when you could point to bodies and proclamations and say definitively that something had changed. Governing was grinding. Governing was mediating disputes between families who had been feuding for generations. Governing was calculating tax rates that would fund necessary services without crushing merchants who were already struggling. Governing was sitting through endless meetings where every decision created new problems that required more meetings. Kaedric hated every minute of it. But he did it anyway because the alternative was delegating to people who would inevitably revert to the old methods the moment he stopped paying attention. Elara proved invaluable. She understood systems in ways he did not, could see 3 steps ahead when he was still processing the immediate problem. And more importantly, she was willing to make unpopular decisions and then explain them in ways that made people understand the logic even when they disagreed with the outcome. They worked together from dawn until long after dark most days, planning infrastructure projects, reviewing judicial reforms, meeting with representatives from villages that had never had direct access to ducal authority before and were not entirely sure what to do with it now that it was available. It was exhausting. It was also the first time in Kaedric's life that he felt like he was building something instead of just maintaining inherited structures through threat of violence. That feeling did not erase the guilt of what he had done to reach this point, did not bring back his brother or the countless others who had died because he had chosen expedience over principle, did not make him sleep better at night when he woke up remembering specific faces of people he had executed personally. But it was something, a direction that pointed toward redemption, even if full redemption was impossible for someone who had accumulated as much blood on his hands as he had. On a cold evening, 6 months after returning from the capital, Kaedric stood in the private library overlooking the cliffs where waves crashed against rocks that had stood for millennia and would continue standing long after everyone currently alive was forgotten. Elara entered without knocking. They had stopped pretending formality months ago. She carried 2 glasses of wine and offered him one. "The council sent their quarterly report," she said. "Tax revenue is up because merchants actually believe they will not be randomly extorted now. Crime is down because we implemented actual judicial oversight instead of just executing whoever seemed convenient. And most surprisingly, 3 neighboring duchies have sent inquiries about implementing similar reforms in their own territories. Kaedric took the wine but did not drink. That is encouraging until you remember that success makes us threatening to everyone who benefits from the old system. The more effective we are at demonstrating alternative approaches, the more incentive they have to destroy us before the model spreads. True, which is why I have been quietly coordinating with those 3 duchies to establish mutual defense agreements. If any of us are attacked for reform efforts, the others provide military support. It creates a network that is harder to eliminate than isolated territories. That is dangerously close to the kind of political maneuvering we claim to oppose. Opposing corruption is not the same as opposing strategy. Marius used networks to perpetuate evil. We can use them to protect reform. The tool is neutral. What matters is the purpose. Kedrick finally drank. The wine was good, but he barely tasted it. His attention was on the ocean beyond the window, on the endless movement of water that shaped stone over centuries through patient repetition rather than sudden violence. That was the lesson he kept learning and forgetting and learning again. Lasting change required patience and consistency, required showing up every day and making incremental progress, even when nothing felt like it was moving fast enough. Revolution was fire. Governance was water. And you needed both to transform landscapes, but only one of them could be sustained over time without consuming everything it touched. Tell me honestly, he said without looking away from the window, do you think we are actually making a difference? Or are we just performing reform while the fundamental structures remain unchanged beneath the surface? Alara came to stand beside him, both of them watching the ocean. I think we are making a difference in ways we will not fully understand for years. Some of it is performance. Some of it is genuine structural change. Most of it is something in between where intentions and outcomes do not align perfectly, but trend in better directions than they would have otherwise. She paused. My father used to say that governance is the art of managing the distance between ideals and reality. You cannot eliminate that distance, but you can shrink it incrementally until the reality starts to resemble the ideals closely enough that people notice the difference and begin to believe change is possible. Did he believe that before they executed him? I do not know. But I choose to believe it anyway because the alternative is accepting that nothing matters and everyone who tries to improve systems is doomed to fail identically. And I refuse to accept that even if it turns out to be true. Kedrick set his glass down and turned to face her. We have never discussed what happens next, after the reforms are established, after the immediate crisis passes. Do we continue this partnership indefinitely, or do we eventually acknowledge that our alliance was temporary and go our separate ways? Alara smiled slightly. That is your way of asking whether this has become something beyond strategic cooperation without actually asking the question directly. Yes. She stepped closer, not touching but near enough that he could see the details of her expression in the firelight, the same face that had confronted him in the capital and challenged him in throne rooms and stood beside him while they burned down an empire. I spent 2 years planning revenge against the people who destroyed my family, she said quietly. I learned to manipulate, to lie, to use people as tools while pretending to care about their well-being. I became proficient at every method I claimed to oppose because becoming proficient was necessary for survival. She reached up and touched his face. A gesture that was simultaneously intimate and analytical, examining rather than caressing. And then I met you, a man who had done all the same things for all the same reasons and was just as damaged by the experience. And I realized that maybe the only people capable of actually changing systems are the ones broken enough by those systems that they understand exactly how they function from the inside. Her hand dropped. So to answer your question, I do not know what this is. I do not know if broken people can build something that is not also broken. But I know that attempting it with you feels less impossible than attempting it alone. And that is the closest I can get to certainty about anything. Kaedric took her hand, held it carefully like holding something that could shatter if gripped too tightly. Everything you just said is true. We are both damaged. We are both compromised by methods we needed to survive. And neither of us knows if what we are building will outlast us or collapse the moment we stop holding it together through sheer force of will. He pulled her closer. But I would rather fail at this with you than succeed at anything else with anyone else. Because you are the only person I have met who understands that power is not the goal. It is just the tool, and the real question is whether you use that tool to perpetuate the same cycles, or whether you break the cycles, even if breaking them means destroying yourself in the process. They stood together in silence that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then Alara said, "We are going to fail eventually. Reform this ambitious always produces reaction. Conservative forces will consolidate. Circumstances will change. And at some point, we will have to make choices between maintaining what we built and starting over, because maintenance has become just another form of oppression. I know. And when that happens, we might have to destroy each other to prevent becoming the next Marius. The next corrupt authority that believes its continuation justifies any atrocity. I know that too. And you are still willing to attempt this? I am willing to attempt this because the alternative is returning to the fortress and ruling through fear until someone younger and more ruthless eventually kills me the same way I killed everyone. Who came before? That is not living. That is just waiting for death while pretending the waiting has purpose. He kissed her, not with desperation or passion, but with the quiet certainty of two people who had seen the worst of each other and decided that worst was still worth building something with. When they separated, Alara said, "This is probably the most honest relationship that has ever existed between two people this broken." Probably. But honesty is all we have. Everything else is performance or delusion. They stood together watching the ocean until long after dark, neither of them speaking, both of them understanding that they had just committed to something that would define the rest of their lives, regardless of whether it succeeded or failed. This was not love in any traditional sense. Love implied innocence and hope and belief that the other person would make you better than you were alone. This was something harder. Recognition. Partnership between people who understood exactly how dark the other person was capable of being and chose to stand beside them anyway, because isolation was worse than the risk of eventual betrayal. Outside, winter storms were building over the northern sea. Inside Blackthorn Keep, two people who had destroyed an empire were attempting to build something in the ruins that might justify the destruction. It would probably fail, but failure in pursuit of something worthwhile was still better than success at perpetuating inherited evil. And that was as close to redemption as either of them was likely to achieve. Mistress. 5 years passed. The reforms held in Thornmarch and spread to 7 neighboring territories. Tax systems became transparent. Courts became accessible to common people. Infrastructure projects employed thousands who had previously survived through banditry or begging. It was not perfect. Corruption still existed in smaller forms. Violence still erupted when disputes could not be resolved peacefully. The old noble families still resisted every change and conspired constantly to restore previous arrangements. But the overall direction was towards something that looked more like justice than what had existed before. Caedric and Alara governed together without formal marriage because marriage would have implied hierarchy that neither wanted. Instead, they built a partnership that operated through negotiated authority where both of them could veto decisions, but both were required to explain those vetoes in ways the other could understand and potentially accept. It was exhausting. It required constant communication and willingness to admit when you were wrong, an ability to separate personal disagreement from professional necessity. But it worked better than any system Caedric had seen elsewhere, where power concentrated in single individuals who inevitably became tyrants regardless of their original intentions. On the 5-year anniversary of the day they had executed Marius in the throne room, Caedric stood in the same library overlooking the cliffs where he had spent so much time thinking about the distance between who he was and who he wanted to become. Alara was in the capital negotiating with the king about expanding reforms to additional territories. Corvin was managing daily administrative functions with the same quiet competence he had demonstrated for decades. The household staff had grown to include dozens of people specifically trained in new governance methods. Everything had changed. Everything was still changing. And Caedric stood alone in the library, understanding that he would never escape the guilt of what he had done to reach this point, would never fully believe he deserved the peace he had managed to build from the ashes of so much destruction. But maybe that was acceptable. Maybe carrying that guilt forward was exactly what prevented him from becoming the kind of ruler who could commit atrocities without conscience. Maybe the weight was the price of remaining human instead of transforming into the kind of monster power usually produced. Corvin entered carrying a letter sealed with the royal crest. "From the capital, my lord. Delivered by courier this morning." Caedric opened it and read quickly. The king was requesting his presence for consultation on succession planning. The crown prince had proven incapable of governance, and the king wanted to establish alternative arrangements that would prevent the crown from falling to someone who would undo the reforms. It was both opportunity and threat. Opportunity to influence the next generation of rulers. Threat that getting involved in succession meant becoming vulnerable, to the same political games that had nearly killed him 5 years ago. He set the letter down and looked at Corvin. "What would you advise?" Corvin was silent for several seconds, then said, "5 years ago, I would have advised refusing, maintaining isolation, protecting what you had built by avoiding entanglement with larger conflicts. And now? Now I think isolation is just slow death. If you want the reforms to outlast us, they need to spread beyond territories we directly control. That requires engaging with succession, even if engagement creates vulnerability." Kadric nodded slowly. That was his assessment as well, which meant returning to the capital, returning to the place where everything had nearly ended, risking everything they had built on the possibility that this time would be different because they were different. It was terrifying. It was also necessary. He walked to the window one last time and looked out at the ocean that had witnessed centuries of rulers making similar calculations. How many of them had believed they would be different? How many had actually succeeded? How many had failed and been forgotten, except as cautionary tales told by people who thought themselves wiser but were really just luckier with timing? No way to know. All you could do was make your best judgment and live with whatever consequences resulted from that judgment. Kadric had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid consequences by maintaining perfect control through fear and manipulation. But 5 years of attempting actual governance had taught him something his father never learned and Marius never acknowledged. Control was an illusion. You could pretend you had it. You could build structures that looked like control from the outside, but underneath, everything was chaos held together temporarily by people choosing to cooperate rather than rebel. And the only thing that made people choose cooperation over rebellion was believing the people in authority were at least trying to serve interests beyond their own. Kadric had become that person almost by accident, not because he was virtuous or wise or any of the pleasant lies people told about good rulers, but because he had been broken thoroughly enough that maintaining the old methods felt more painful than attempting new ones. That was the truth no one wanted to acknowledge about reform. It rarely came from people who were inherently better. It came from people who had been damaged so completely that they could not return to previous patterns without confronting exactly how much harm those patterns had caused. He turned away from the window. "Send word to Lady Ashford that I will be joining her in the capital," he told Corvin, "and prepare an escort. Large enough to demonstrate we are serious, but small enough to show we are not invading." Corvin bowed and left. Kadric stood alone in the library for several more minutes, thinking about his brother, about his father, about Marius and the king and every person whose death had created the space for what came after. They had not died for justice or reform or any noble purpose. They had died because violence was the fundamental structure beneath every social arrangement, and sometimes that violence erupted in ways that produced change alongside the destruction. Making that change meaningful required acknowledging it was built on graves, required carrying that weight forward instead of pretending the foundation was clean, and required believing that people who survived by becoming monsters could potentially transform into something else if they were willing to do the harder work of governing rather than just ruling. Kadric did not know if he believed that completely, but he was committed to acting as if it were true because the alternative was unacceptable. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the northern sea the way they did every winter. Inside Blackthorn Keep, a man who had once executed his brother in a courtyard was preparing to return to the place where he had helped burn down an empire and see if anything worthwhile could be built from the ashes. This was what redemption looked like for people who had gone too far to ever be truly redeemed. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just the relentless work of attempting to create value that might eventually outweigh the harm you had caused. It would never be enough. The dead would stay dead. The damage would remain permanent. And history would judge harshly, regardless of how much good came after, because history had no mechanism for weighing suffering against improvement. But it was something. A direction that pointed toward meaning, even if full meaning was impossible. And for Kadric Blackwood, standing in a fortress his family had built through generations of oppression, attempting something meaningful was as close to peace as he was ever going to achieve. He left the library and walked through corridors where servants no longer flinched when he passed, where the atmosphere was still cold stone and northern wind, but no longer carried the weight of constant fear that had defined this place for centuries. Change was slow. Change was incomplete. Change would probably reverse the moment he and Alara stopped fighting for it. But it was real, and real was enough. He stepped into the courtyard where horses were being prepared, the same courtyard where he had executed his brother, where bloodstains had remained visible for weeks, as a reminder of what happened when people miscalculated the distance between family and survival. Those stains were gone now, worn away by weather and time and the endless movement of people who had other concerns beyond the violence that had occurred there years ago. That was the other truth about power and consequence that no one wanted to acknowledge. Eventually, everything faded. The good and the bad, both. What felt permanent in the moment became stories told by people who had not been there and did not fully understand what had actually happened. All you could do was try to make those stories reflect something worth remembering. Try to ensure that when people eventually forgot the specific details, what remained was the sense that someone had at least attempted to build rather than just destroy. Kedrick mounted his horse. Around him the escort assembled. Soldiers who served not through fear, but through belief that what they were protecting was worth protecting. That was new. That was different from how his father had maintained authority. Whether it would last remained to be seen. But for now, it was enough. He turned his horse toward the gates. Behind him, Blackthorn Keep stood dark against darker sky, exactly as it had for generations, and would continue standing for generations after everyone currently alive was forgotten. But maybe now it stood for something slightly different than it had before. Not redemption, not justice, but the possibility that people broken by power could occasionally transform that breaking into something that served purposes beyond simple domination. That was as close to hope as Kedrick Blackwood was ever going to get. And as he rode toward the capital where everything had nearly ended 5 years ago, he carried that fragile hope forward like a flame that would probably go out but was worth protecting anyway because the alternative was darkness. The northern wind followed him south through landscapes slowly rebuilding from the chaos that revolution had produced. Villages were being repopulated. Fields were being cultivated again. Children who had grown up during the violence were learning that governance could occasionally mean something other than random cruelty from distant authorities they would never meet. It was not enough. Would never be enough to justify the suffering that had produced it. But it was something, and something Kedrick had learned through 5 years of grinding daily work was infinitely better than the nothing he had been heading toward before Alara Ashford walked into his life and forced him to confront exactly what he had become in the pursuit of power he no longer wanted. The road stretched ahead toward the capital and whatever challenges waited there. Behind him, Thornmarch continued its slow transformation. And somewhere in the space between past and future, a man who had once been a monster was attempting to become something else. Not better, necessarily, but different in ways that might eventually matter to people who would never know his name but would live in the world his choices helped shape. That was legacy, not the monuments or the formal histories or the ceremonies, but the quiet accumulation of decisions that made life incrementally more bearable for people you would never meet. And as the fortress disappeared behind him and the road opened ahead, Kedrick Blackwood allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, broken people could build things that were not also broken. Or if they could not, they could at least try. And the trying itself was worth something even if it ultimately failed. The storm clouds followed him south, but for the first time in years, he was not afraid of storms, just ready to face whatever they brought and do his best to survive with enough of himself intact that the survival meant something beyond simple continuation. That was all anyone could do. All anyone had ever been able to do despite the pretensions of power and the illusions of control. And it was enough.